Thank you for listening to our audiobooks. We do our best to regularly upload quality books with clear narrations. Please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell icon so we can bring you more great books. Thank you very much and enjoy your audiobook.
Chapter 26. I leant on the handle of my spade, wiped away the sweat which had begun to run into my eyes, and gazed around me at the hundreds of men scattered over the dusty green. We were still on our toughening course. At least that's what they told us it was. I had a private suspicion that they just didn't know what to do with all the air crews under training, and that somebody had devised this method of getting us out of the way. Anyway, we were building a reservoir near a charming little Shropshire town, and a whole village of tents had sprung up to house us. Nobody was quite sure about the reservoir, but we were supposed to be building something. They issued us with denim suits and pickaxes and spades, and for hour after hour we pecked desultorily at a rocky hillside. But, hot as I was, I couldn't help thinking that things could be a lot worse. The weather was wonderful, and it was a treat to be in the open all day. I looked down the slope and away across the sweetly rolling countryside to where low hills rose in the blue distance. It was a gentler landscape than the stark fells and moors I had left behind in Yorkshire, but infinitely soothing. And the roofs of the town showing above the trees held a rich promise. During the hours under the fierce sun, with the rock dust caking round our lips, we built up a gargantuan thirst which we nurtured carefully till the evening, when we were allowed out of camp. There, in cool taverns in the company of country folk, we slaked it with pints of glorious rough cider. I don't suppose you could find any there now. It is mostly factory-made cider which is drunk in the south of England these days, but many of the pubs used to have their own presses where they squeezed the juice from the local apples. To me, there was something disturbing about sleeping in a tent. Each morning, when I awoke with the early sun beating on the thin walls, it was as if I were back in the hills above the Firth of Clyde long before the war was dreamt of. There was something very evocative about the tent smell of hot canvas and rubber ground sheet and crushed grass and the flies buzzing in a little cloud at the top of the pole. I was jerked back in an instant to Rosneath, and when I opened my eyes I half expected to find Alex Taylor and Eddie Hutchinson, the friends of my boyhood, lying there in their sleeping bags. The three of us went camping at Rosneath every weekend from Easter to October, leaving the smoke and dirt of Glasgow behind us. And here in Shropshire, in the uncanny tent smell, when I closed my eyes I could see the little pine wood behind the tent and the green hillside running down to the burn, and, far below, the long blue mirror of the Garaloch glinting under the great mountains of Argyll. They have desecrated Rosneath and the Garloch now, but to me as a boy it was a fairyland which led me into the full wonder and beauty of the world. It was strange that I should dwell on that period when I was in my teens, because Alex was in the Middle East, Eddie was in Burma, and I was in another tent with a lot of different young men. And it was as though the time between had been rubbed away, and Darrowby and Helen and all my struggles in veterinary practice had never happened. Yet those years in Darrowby had been the most important of my life. I used to sit up and shake myself, wondering at how much my thoughts had been mixed up by the war. But, as I say, I quite enjoyed Shropshire. The only snag was that reservoir, or whatever it was we were hacking out of the face of the hill. I could never get really involved with it, so that I picked up my ears when our flight sergeant made an announcement one morning. "Some of our local farmers want help with their harvest," he called out at the early parade. "Are there any volunteers?" My hand was the first up, and after a few moments' hesitation others followed, but none of my particular friends volunteered for the job. When everything had been sorted out, I found I had been allotted to a farmer Edwards, with 3 other airmen who were from a different flight and strangers to me. Mr. Edwards arrived the following day and packed the 4 of us into a typical big, old-fashioned farmer's car. I sat in the front with him while the other 3 filled the back. He asked our names, but nothing else, as though he felt that our station in civil life was none of his concern. He was about 35, with jet-black hair above a sunburnt face. in which his white teeth and clear blue eyes shone startlingly. He looked us over with a good-humoured grin as we rolled into his farmyard. "Well, here you are, lads," he said. "This is where we are going to put you through it." But I hardly heard him. I was looking around me at the scene which had been part of my life a few months ago. The cobbled yard, the rows of doors leading to cow byre, barn, pigsties and loose boxes. An old man was mucking out the byre, and as the rich bovine smell drifted across, one of my companions wrinkled his nose. But I inhaled it like perfume. The farmer led us all into the fields, where a reaper and binder was at work, leaving the sheaves of corn lying in long golden swathes. "Any of you ever done any stooking?" he asked. We shook our heads dumbly. "Never mind, you'll soon learn. You come with me, Jim." We spaced ourselves out in the big field, each of my colleagues with an old man, while Mr. Edwards took charge of me. It didn't take me long to realise that I'd got the tough section. The farmer grabbed a sheaf in each hand, tucked them under his arms, walked a few steps, and planted them on end, resting against each other. I did the same till there were 8 sheaves making up a stook. He showed us how to dig the stalks into the ground so that they stood upright, and sometimes he gave a nudge with his knee to keep them in the right alignment. I did my best, but often my sheaves would fall over and I had to dart back and replace them. And I noticed with some alarm that Mr. Edwards was going about twice as fast as the 3 old men. He had nearly finished the row while they were barely halfway along, and my aching arms and back told me I was in for a testing time. We went on like that for about 2 hours, bending, lifting, and shuffling forward without an instant's respite. One of the strongest impressions I had gained when I first came into country practice was that farming was the hardest way of all of making a living, and now I was finding out for myself. I was about ready to throw myself down on the stubble when Mrs. Edwards came over the field with her young son and daughter. They carried baskets with the ingredients for our 10 o'clock break, crusty apple tarts and jugs of cider. The farmer watched me quizzically as I sank gratefully down and began to drink like a parched traveller in the desert. The cider from his own press was superb, and I closed my eyes as I swallowed. The right thing, it seemed to me, would be to lie here in the sunshine for the rest of the day with about a gallon of this exquisite brew by my side, but Mr. Edwards had other ideas. I was still chewing at the solid crust when he grasped a fresh pair of sheaves. "Right, lad, must get on," he grunted, and I was back on the treadmill. With a pause at lunchtime for bread, cheese, and more cider, we went on at breakneck speed all day. I have always been grateful to the RAF for what they did for my physical well-being. When I was called up, there was no doubt I was going slightly to seed under Helen's beneficent regime. Too much good cooking and the discovery of the charms of an armchair. I was getting fat, but the RAF changed all that, and I don't think I have ever slipped back. After the 6 months at Scarborough, I am certain I didn't carry a surplus pound. Marching, drilling, PT, running, I could trot 5 miles along the beach and cliffs without trouble. When I arrived in Shropshire, I was really fit. But I wasn't as fit as Mr. Edwards. He was a compact bundle of power. Not very big, but with the wiry durability I remembered in the Yorkshire farmers. He seemed tireless, hardly breaking sweat as he moved along the rows, corded brown arms bulging from the sleeves of a faded collarless shirt, slightly bowed legs stumping effortlessly. The sensible thing would have been to tell him straight that I couldn't go at his pace, but some demon of pride impelled me to keep up with him. I am quite sure he didn't mean to rub it in. Like any other farmer, he had a job to do and was anxious to get on with it. At the lunch break, he looked at me with some commiseration as I stood there, shirt sticking to my back, mouth hanging open, ribs heaving. "You're doing fine, Jim," he said, and then, as if noticing my distress for the first time, he shifted his feet awkwardly. "I know you city lads ain't used to this kind of work, and, well, it's not a question of strength, it's just knowing how to do it." When we drove back to camp that night, I could hear my companions groaning in the back of the car. They too had suffered, but not as badly as me. After a few days, I did begin to get the knack of the thing, and though it still tested me to the utmost, I was never on the border of collapse again. Mr. Edwards noticed the improvement and slapped me playfully on the shoulder. "What did I tell you? It's just knowing how to do it. But a new purgatory awaited me when we started to load the corn onto the stack. Forking the sheaves up onto the cart, roping them there, then throwing them again, higher and higher as the stack grew in size, I realised with a jolt that stooking had been easy. Mrs. Edwards joined in this part. She stood on the top of the stack with her husband expertly turning the sheaves towards him while he arranged them as they should be. I had the unskilled job way below, toiling as never before, back-breaking, the handle of the fork blistering my palms. I just couldn't go fast enough, and Mr. Edwards had to hop down to help me, grasping a fork and hurling the sheaves up with easy flicks of the wrist. He looked at me as before and spoke the encouraging words, "You're coming along grand, Jim. It's just knowing how to do it." But there were many compensations. The biggest was being among farming folk again. Mrs. Edwards, in her undemonstrative way, was obviously anxious to show hospitality to these 4 rather bewildered city boys far from home, and set us down to a splendid meal every evening. She was dark like her husband, with large eyes which joined in her quick smile, and a figure which managed to be thin and shapely at the same time. She hadn't much chance to get fat because she never stopped working. When she wasn't outside throwing the corn around like any man, she was cooking and baking, looking after her children, and scouring her great barn of a farmhouse. Those evening meals were something to look forward to and remember. Steaming rabbit pies with fresh green beans and potatoes from the garden, bilberry tarts and apple crumble, and a massive jug of thick cream to pour ad lib, home-baked bread and farm cheese. The 4 of us revelled in the change from the RAF fare. It was said that aircrews got the best food in the services, and I believed it. But after a while it all began to taste the same. Maybe it was the bulk cooking, but it palled in time. Sitting at the farm table, looking at Mrs. Edwards serving us, at her husband eating stolidly, and at the 2 children, a girl of 10 whose dark eyes showed a promise of her mother's attractiveness, and a sturdy, brown-limbed boy of 8, the thought recurred. They were good stock. The clever economists who tell us that we don't need British agriculture, and that our farms should be turned into national parks, seem to ignore the rather obvious snag that an unfriendly country could starve us into submission in a week. But to me, a greater tragedy still would be the loss of a whole community of people like the Edwards. It was late one afternoon, and I was feeling more of a weakling than ever, with Mr. Edwards throwing the sheaves around as though they were weightless, while I groaned and strained. The farmer was called away to attend to a calving cow, and as he hopped blithely from the stack, he patted my shoulder as I leant on my fork. "Never mind, Jim," he laughed. "It's just knowing how to do it." An hour later we were going into the kitchen for our meal when Mrs. Edwards said, "My husband's still on with that cow. He must be having difficulty with her." I hesitated at the doorway. "Do you mind if I go and see how he's getting on?" She smiled. "All right, if you like. I'll keep your food warm for you." I crossed the yard and went into the byre. One of the old men was holding the tail of the big red pole and puffing his pipe placidly. Mr. Edwards, stripped to the waist, had his arm in the cow up to the shoulder. But it was a different Mr. Edwards. His back and chest glistened, and droplets of sweat ran down his nose and dripped steadily from the end. His mouth gaped, and he panted as he fought his private battle somewhere inside. He turned glazed eyes in my direction. At first he didn't seem to see me in his absorption, then recognition dawned. "Hello, Jim," he muttered breathlessly. "I've got a right job on here." "I'm sorry to hear that. What's the trouble?" He began to reply, then screwed up his face. "Oh, the old bitch! She's squeezing the life out of my arm again. She'll break it before she's finished." He paused, head down, to recover. Then he looked up at me. "The calf's laid wrong, Jim. There's just a tail coming into the passage, and I can't get the hind legs round." A breach. My favourite presentation, but one which always defeated farmers. I couldn't blame them really, because they had never had the opportunity to read Franz Bernesch's classical work on veterinary obstetrics, which explains the mechanics of partition so lucidly. One phrase has always stuck in my mind: the necessity for simultaneous application of antagonistic forces. Bernesh points out that in order to correct many malpresentations, it is necessary to apply traction and repulsion at the same time, and to do that with one hand in a straining cow is impossible. As though to endorse my thoughts, Mr. Edwards burst out once more. "Oh, dang it, I've missed it again. I keep pushing the hock away, then grabbing for the foot, but the old bitch just shoves it all back at me. I've been doing this for an hour now, and I'm about knackered." I never thought I would hear such words from this tough little man, but there was no doubt he had suffered. The cow was a massive animal with a back like a dining table, and she was heaving the farmer back effortlessly every time she strained. We didn't see many red pearls in Yorkshire, but the ones I had met were self-willed and strong as elephants. The idea of pushing against one for an hour made me quail. Mr. Edwards pulled his arm out and stood for a moment leaning against the hair ramp. The animal was quite unperturbed by the interference of this puny human, but the farmer was a picture of exhaustion. He worked his dangling fingers gingerly, then looked up at me. "By God," he grunted. "She's given me some stick. I've got hardly any feeling left in this arm." He didn't have to tell me. I had known that sensation many a time. Even Bernesh, in the midst of his coldly scientific repositions, retropulsions, malpositions, and counteracting pressures, so far unbends as to state that great demands are made upon the strength of the operator. Mr. Edwards would agree with him. The farmer took a long, shuddering breath and moved over to the bucket of hot water on the floor. He washed his arms, then turned back to the cow with something like dread on his face. "Look," I said, "please let me help you." He gave a pallid smile. "Thanks, Jim, but there's nothing you can do. Those legs have got to come round." "Well, that's what I mean. I can do it." "What?" "With a bit of help from you. Have you got a piece of binder twine handy?" "Aye, we've got yards of it, lad. But I'm telling you, you need experience for this job. You know nothing about—" He stopped because I was already pulling my shirt over my head. He was too tired to argue in any case. Hanging the shirt on a nail on the wall, bending over the bucket and soaping my arms with the scent of the antiseptic coming up to me brought a rush of memories which was almost overwhelming. I held out my hand and Mr. Edwards wordlessly passed me a length of twine. I soaked it in the water, then quickly tied a slip knot at one end and inserted my hand into the cow. Ah, yes. And there was the tail, so familiar, hanging between the calves' pelvic bones. Oh, I did love a breech, and I ran my hand with almost voluptuous satisfaction along the hair of the limb till I reached the tiny foot. It was a moment's work to push the loop over the fetlock and tighten it while I passed the free end between the digits of the cloven foot. "Hold that," I said to the farmer, "and pull it steadily when I tell you." I put my hand on the hock and began to push it away from me into the uterus. "Now, pull," I said, "but carefully, don't jerk." Like a man in a dream, he did as I said, and within seconds the foot popped out of the vulva. "Hell!" said Mr. Edwards. "Now for the other one," I murmured as I removed the loop. I repeated the procedure, the farmer, slightly pop-eyed, pulling on the twine. The second little hoof, yellow and moist, joined its fellow on the outside almost immediately. "Bloody hell," said Mr. Edwards. "Right," I said. "Grab a leg and we'll have him out in a couple of ticks." We each took a hold and leant back. But the big cow did the job for us, giving a great heave which deposited the calf wet and wriggling into my arms. I staggered back and dropped with it onto the straw. "Grand bull calf, Mr. Edwards," I said. "Better give him a rub down." The farmer shot me a disbelieving glance, then twisted some hay into a wisp and began to dry off the little creature. "If you ever get stuck with a breech presentation again," I said, "I'll show you what you ought to do. You have to push and pull at the same time, and that's where the twine comes in. As you repel the hock with your hand, somebody else pulls the foot around. But you'll notice I have the twine between the calf's cleats, and that's important. That way it lifts the sharp little foot up and prevents injury to the vaginal wall." The farmer nodded dumbly and went on with his rubbing. When he had finished, he looked up at me in bewilderment, and his lips moved soundlessly a few times before he spoke. "What the... How the heck do you know all that?" I told him. There was a long pause, then he exploded. "You young bugger! You kept that dark, didn't you?" "Well, you never asked me." He scratched his head. "Well, I don't want to be nosy with you lads that help me. Some folks don't like it." His voice trailed away. We dried our arms and donned our shirts in silence. Before leaving, he looked over at the calf, already making strenuous efforts to rise as its mother licked it. "He's a lively little beggar," he said. "And we might have lost him. I'm right grateful to you." He put an arm round my shoulders. "Anyway, come on, Mr. Veterinary Surgeon, and we'll have some supper." Halfway across the yard, he stopped and regarded me ruefully. "You know, I must have looked proper daft to you. Fumbling away inside there for an hour and damn near killing myself, then you step up and do it in a couple of minutes. I feel as weak as a girl." "Not in the least, Mr. Edwards," I replied. It's I hesitated a moment. "It's not a question of strength, it's just knowing how to do it." He nodded, then became very still, and the seconds stretched out as he stared at me. Suddenly his teeth shone as the brown face broke into an ever-widening grin, which developed into a great shout of laughter. He was still laughing helplessly when we reached the house, and as I opened the kitchen door, he leant against the wall and wiped his eyes. "You young devil," he said. "You really got a bit of your own back there, didn't you?" Chapter 27. At last we were on our way to flying school. It was at Windsor, and that didn't seem far on the map, but it was a typical wartime journey of endless stops and changes and interminable waits. It went on all through the night, and we took our sleep in snatches. I stole an hour's fitful slumber on the waiting-room table at a tiny, nameless station, and despite my hard, pillowless bed, I drifted deliciously back to Darrowby. I was bumping along the rutted track to Netherlees Farm, hanging on to the jerking wheel. I could see the house below me, its faded red tiles showing above the sheltering trees, and behind the buildings the scrubby hillside rose to the moor. Up there the trees were stunted and sparse and dotted widely over the steep flanks. Higher still there was only scree and cliff, and right at the top, beckoning in the sunshine, I saw the beginning of the moor, smooth, unbroken, and bare. A scar on the broad sweep of green showed where long ago they quarried the stones to build the massive farmhouses and the enduring walls which have stood against the unrelenting climate for hundreds of years. Those houses and those endlessly marching walls would still be there when I was gone and forgotten. Helen was with me in the car. I loved it when she came with me on my rounds, and after the visit to the farm we climbed up the fellside, panting through the scent of the warm bracken, feeling the old excitement as we neared the summit. Then we were on the top, facing into the wide, free moorland and the clean Yorkshire wind, and the cloud shadows racing over the greens and browns. Helen's hand was warm in mine as we wandered among the heather through its green islets, nibbled to a velvet sward by the sheep. She raised a finger as a curlew's lonely cry sounded across the wild tapestry, and the wonder in her eyes shone through the dark flurry of hair blowing across her face. The gentle shaking at my shoulder pulled me back to wakefulness, to the hiss of steam and the clatter of boots. The tabletop was hard against my hip, and my neck was stiff where it had rested on my pack. "Train's in, Jim," an airman was looking down at me. "I hated to wake you. You were smiling." 2 hours later, sweaty, unshaven, half asleep, laden with kit, we shuffled into the airfield at Windsor. Sitting in the wooden building, we only half listened to the corporal giving us our introductory address. Then suddenly, his words struck home. "There's one other thing," he said. "Remember to wear your identity discs at all times. We had 2 prangs last week. Couple of fellas burned beyond recognition, and neither of them was wearing his discs. We don't know who they were." He spread his hands appealingly. This sort of thing makes a lot of work for us. So remember what I've told you. In a moment, we were all wide awake and listening intently, probably thinking, as I was, that we had only been playing at being airmen up till now. I looked through the window at the windsock blowing over the long, flat stretch of green, at the scattered aircraft, the fire tender, the huddle of low wooden huts. The playing was over now. This was where everything started. Chapter 28. This was a very different uniform. The Wellingtons and breeches of my country vet days seemed far away as I climbed into the baggy flying suit and pulled on the sheepskin boots and the gloves. The silk ones first, then the big clumsy pair on top. It was all new, but I had a feeling of pride. Leather helmet and goggles next. Then I fastened on my parachute, passing the straps over my shoulders and between my legs, and buckling them against my chest before shuffling out of the flight hut onto the long stretch of sunlit grass. Flying Officer Woodham was waiting for me there. He was to be my instructor, and he glanced at me apprehensively as though he didn't relish the prospect. With his dark, boyish good looks, he resembled all the pictures I'd seen of Battle of Britain pilots, and in fact, like all our instructors, he had been through this crisis in our history. They had been sent here as a kind of holiday after their tremendous experience, but it was said that they regarded their operations against the enemy as a picnic compared with this. They had faced the might of the Luftwaffe without flinching, but we terrified them. As we walked over the grass, I could see one of my friends coming into land. The little biplane slewed and weaved crazily in the sky. It just missed the clump of trees, then about 50 feet from the ground it dropped like a stone, bounced high on its wheels, bounced twice again, then zigzagged to a halt. The helmeted head in the rear cockpit jerked and nodded as though it were making some pointed remarks to the head in front. Flying Officer Woodham's face was expressionless, but I knew what he was thinking. It was his turn next. The tiger moth looked very small and alone on the wide stretch of green. I climbed up and strapped myself into the cockpit while my instructor got in behind me. He went through the drill, which I would soon know by heart like a piece of poetry. A fitter gave the propeller a few turns for priming, then contact. The fitter swung the prop, the engine roared, the chocks were pulled away from the wheels, and we were away, bumping over the grass, then suddenly and miraculously lifting, and soaring high over the straggle of huts into the summer sky, with the patchwork of the soft countryside of southern England unfolding beneath us. I felt a sudden elation, not just because I liked the sensation, but because I had waited so long for this moment. The months of drilling and marching and studying navigation had been leading up to the time when I would take to the air, and now it had arrived. Flight Officer Woodham's voice came over the intercom. "Now you've got her. Take the stick and hold her steady. Watch the artificial horizon and keep it level. See that cloud ahead? Line yourself up with it and keep your nose on it." I gripped the joystick in my gauntleted hand. This was lovely. And easy, too. They had told me flying would be a simple matter, and they had been right. It was child's play. Cruising along, I glanced down at the grandstand of Ascot Racecourse far below. I was just beginning to smile happily when a voice crashed in my ear. "Relax, for God's sake! What the hell are you playing at?" I couldn't understand him. I felt perfectly relaxed, and I thought I was doing fine, but in the mirror I could see my instructor's eyes glaring through his goggles. No, that's no bloody good. Relax, can't you hear me? Relax!" "Yes, sir," I quavered, and immediately began to stiffen up. I couldn't imagine what was troubling the man, but as I began to stare with increasing desperation, now at the artificial horizon, then at the nose of the aircraft against the cloud ahead, the noises over the intercom became increasingly apoplectic. I didn't seem to have a single problem, yet all I could hear were curses and groans, and on one occasion the voice rose to a scream. "Get your bloody finger out, will you?" I stopped enjoying myself, and a faint misery welled in me. And as always, when that happened, I began to think of Helen, and the happier life I had left behind. In the open cockpit, the wind thundered in my ears, lending vivid life to the picture forming in my mind. The wind was thundering here, too, but it was against the window of our bed-sitter. It was early November, and a golden autumn had changed with brutal suddenness to Arctic cold. For 2 weeks an icy rain had swept the grey towns and villages which huddled in the folds of the Yorkshire Dales, turning the fields into shallow lakes and the farmyards into squelching mud-holes. Everybody had colds. Some said it was flu, but whatever it was, it decimated the population. Half of Darrowby seemed to be in bed and the other half sneezing at each other. I myself was on a knife edge, crouching over the fire, sucking an antiseptic lozenge and wincing every time I had to swallow. My throat felt raw, and there was an ominous tickling at the back of my nose. I shivered as the rain hurled a drumming cascade of water against the glass. I was all alone in the practice. Siegfried had gone away for a few days, and I just daren't catch cold. It all depended on tonight. If only I could stay indoors and then have a good sleep, I could throw this off. But as I glanced over at the phone on the bedside table, it looked like a crouching beast ready to spring. Helen was sitting on the other side of the fire, knitting. She didn't have a cold. She never did. And even in those early days of our marriage, I couldn't help feeling it was a little unfair. Even now, 35 years later, things are just the same, and as I go around sniffling, I still feel tight-lipped at her obstinate refusal to join me. I pulled my chair closer to the blaze. There was always a lot of night work in our kind of practice, but maybe I would be lucky. It was 8 o'clock with never a cheep, and perhaps fate had decreed that I would not be hauled out into that sodden darkness in my weakened state. Helen came to the end of a row and held up her knitting. It was a sweater for me, about half done. "How does it look, Jim?" she asked. I smiled. There was something in her gesture that seemed to epitomize our life together. I opened my mouth to tell her it was simply smashing, when the phone pealed with a suddenness which made me bite my tongue. Tremblingly, I lifted the receiver while horrid visions of carving heifers floated before me. An hour with my shirt off would just tip me nicely over the brink. "This is Sowden of Long Pasture," a voice croaked. "Yes, Mr. Sowden." I gripped the phone tightly. I would know my fate in a moment. "I have a big calf here. Looks very dowly and grunting bad. Will you come?" A long breath of relief escaped me. A calf with probable stomach trouble. It could have been a lot worse. "Right, I'll see you in 20 minutes, I said. As I turned back to the cosy warmth of the little room, the injustice of life smote me. "I've got to go out, Helen." "Oh, no." "Yes, and I have this cold coming on," I whimpered. "And just listen to that rain." "Yes. You must wrap up well, Jim." I scowled at her. That place is 10 miles away and a cheerless dump if ever there was one. There's not a warm corner anywhere. I fingered my aching throat. A trip out there's just what I need. I'm sure I've got a temperature. I don't know if all veterinary surgeons blame their wives when they get an unwanted call, but heaven help me, I've done it all my life. Instead of giving me a swift kick in the pants, Helen smiled up at me. "I'm really sorry, Jim. But maybe it won't take you long, and you can have a bowl of hot soup when you come back." I nodded, sulkily. Yes, that was something to look forward to. Helen had made some brisket broth that day, rich and meaty, crowded with celery, leeks and carrots, and with a flavour to bring a man back from the dead. I kissed her and trailed off into the night. Long Pasture Farm was in the little hamlet of Dowsett, and I had travelled this narrow road many times. It snaked its way high into the wild country, and on summer days the bare, lonely hills had a serene beauty, treeless and austere, but with a clean wind sweeping over the grassy miles. But tonight, as I peered unhappily through the streaming windscreen, the unseen surrounding black bulk pressed close, and I could imagine the dripping stone walls climbing high to the summits, where the rain drove across the moorland, drenching the heather and bracken, churning the dark mirrors of the bog water into liquid mud. When I saw Mr. Sowden, I realized that I was really quite fit. He had obviously been suffering from the prevalent malady for some time, but like most farmers, he just had to keep going at his hard, ceaseless work. He looked at me from swimming eyes, gave a couple of racking coughs that almost tore him apart, and led me into the buildings. He held an oil lamp high as we entered a lofty barn, and in the feeble light I discerned various rusting farm implements, a heap of potatoes and another of turnips, and in a corner a makeshift pen where my patient stood. It wasn't the 2-week-old baby calf I had half expected. but a little animal of 6 months, almost Stirk age, but not well grown. It had all the signs of a bad doer, thin and pot-bellied, with its light roan coat hanging in a thick overgrown fringe below its abdomen. "Alice been a poor calf," Mr. Sowden wheezed between coughs. "Never seemed to put on flesh. Rain stopped for a bit this afternoon, so I let him out for a bit of fresh air, and now look at him." I climbed into the pen, and as I slipped the thermometer into the rectum, I studied the little creature. He offered no resistance as I gently pushed him to one side. His head hung down, and he gazed apathetically at the floor from deep, sunk eyes. Worst of all was the noise he was making. It was more than a grunt, rather a long, painful groan repeated every few seconds. "It certainly looks like his stomach," I said. "Which field was he in this afternoon?" "I know but let him have a walk round the orchard for a couple of hours." "I see." I looked at the thermometer. The temperature was subnormal. "I suppose there's a bit of fruit lying around there?" Mr. Sowden went into another paroxysm, then leant on the boards of the pen to recover his breath. "Aye, there's apples and pears all over at grass. Had hell of a crop this year." I put the stethoscope over the rumen, and instead of the normal surge and bubble of the healthy stomach, I heard only a deathly silence. I palpated the flank and felt the typically doughy fullness of impaction. "Well, Mr. Sowden, I think he's got a belly full of fruit, and it's brought his digestion to a complete halt." "He's in a bad way." The farmer shrugged. "Well, if he's just a bit bunged up, a good dose of linseed oil would shift him." "I'm afraid it's not as simple as that," I said. "This is a serious condition." "Well, what have we got to do about it, then?" He wiped his nose and looked at me morosely. I hesitated. It was bitterly cold in the old building, and already I was feeling shivery and my throat ached. The thought of Helen and the bed-sitter and the warm fire was unbearably attractive. But I'd seen impactions like this before, and tried treating them with purgatives, and it didn't work. This animal's temperature was falling to the moribund level, and he had a sunken eye. If I didn't do something drastic, he would be dead by morning. "There's only one thing will save him," I said, "and that's a rheumatectomy." "A what?" "An operation. Open up his first stomach and clear out all the stuff that shouldn't be there." "Are you sure? Do you not think a good pint of oil would put him right? It'd be a lot easier." It would indeed. For a moment the far side and Helen glowed like a jewel in a cave. Then I glanced at the calf. Scraggy and long-haired, he looked utterly unimportant, infinitely vulnerable and dependent. It would be the easiest thing in the world to leave him groaning in the dark till morning. "I'm quite sure, Mr. Sowden. He's so weak that I think I'll do it under a local anaesthetic, so we'll need some help." The farmer nodded slowly. "All right. I'll go down village and get George Hindley." He coughed again, painfully. "But by Gover, I could do without this tonight. I'm sure I've got bronchitis." Bronchitis was a common malady among the farmers of those days, and there was no doubt this poor man was suffering from it. But my pang of sympathy faded as he left, because he took the lamp with him, and the darkness closed tightly on me. There are all kinds of barns. Some of them are small, cosy, and fragrant with hay, but this was a terrible place. I had been in here on sunny afternoons, and even then the dank gloom of crumbling walls and rotting beams was like a clammy blanket, and all warmth and softness seemed to disappear among the cobweb rafters high above. I used to feel that people with starry-eyed notions of farming ought to take a look inside that barn. It was evocative of the grim, comfortless other side of the agricultural life. I had it to myself now, and as I stood there listening to the wind rattling the door on its latch, a variety of draughts whistled round me, and a remorseless drip-drip from the broken pantiles on the roof sent icy droplets trickling over my head and neck. And as the minutes ticked away, I began to hop from foot to foot in a vain effort to keep warm. Dale's farmers are never in a hurry, and I hadn't expected a quick return, but after 15 minutes in the impenetrable blackness, bitter thoughts began to assail me. Where the hell was the man? Maybe he and George Hindley were brewing a pot of tea for themselves, or perhaps settling down to a quick game of dominoes. My legs were trembling by the time the oil lamp reappeared in the entrance, and Mr. Sowden ushered his neighbour inside. "Good evening, George," I said. "How are you?" "Only moderate, Mr. Herriot." The newcomer sniffled. This bloody cow's just getting out of me. He blew lustily into a red handkerchief and gazed at me blearily. I looked around me. Well, let's get started. We'll need an operating table. Perhaps you could stack up a few straw bales? The two men trailed out and returned, carrying a couple of bales apiece. When they were built up, they were about the right height, but rather wobbly. We could do with a board on top. I blew on my freezing fingers and stamped my feet. Any ideas? Mr. Sowden rubbed his chin. Aye, we'll get a door. He shuffled out into the yard with his lamp, and I watched him struggling to lift one of the cow-byre doors from its hinges. George went to give him a hand, and as the two of them pulled and heaved, I thought, wearily, that veterinary operations didn't trouble me all that much, but getting ready for them was a killer. Finally, the men staggered back into the barn, laid the door on top of the bales, and the theatre was ready. "Let's get him up," I gasped. We lifted the unresisting little creature onto the improvised table and stretched him on his right side. Mr. Sowden held his head while George took charge of the tail and the rear end. Quickly I laid out my instruments, removed coat and jacket, and rolled up my shirt sleeves. Oh, damn, we've no hot water. Will you bring some, Mr. Sowden? I held the head and again waited interminably while the farmer went to the house. This time it was worse without my warm clothing, and cold ate into me as I pictured the farm kitchen and the slow scooping of the water from the side boiler into a bucket, then the unhurried journey back to the buildings. When Mr. Sowden finally reappeared, I added antiseptic to the bucket and scrubbed my arms feverishly. Then I clipped the hair on the left side and filled the syringe with local anesthetic. But as I infiltrated the area, I felt my hopes sinking. I can hardly see a damn thing. I looked helplessly at the oil lamp balanced on a nearby turnip chopper. That light's in the wrong place. Wordlessly, Mr. Sowden left his place and began to tie a length of plough cord to a beam. He threw it over another beam and made it fast before suspending the lamp above the calf. It was a big improvement, but it took a long time, and by the time he had finished I had abandoned all hope of ever throwing off my cold. I was frozen right through, and a burning sensation had started in my chest. I would soon be in the same state as my helpers. Bronchitis was just round the corner. Anyway, at least I could start now, and I incised skin, muscles, peritoneum, and ruminal wall at record speed. I plunged an arm deep into the opened organ through the fermenting mass of stomach contents, and in a flash all my troubles dissolved. Along the floor of the rumen, apples and pears were spread in layers, some of them bitten, but most of them whole and intact. Bovines take most of their food in big swallows and chew it over later at their leisure, but no animal could make cud out of this lot. I looked up happily. It's just as I thought. He's full of fruit, replied Mr. Sowden. Coughs come in various forms, but this one was tremendous and fundamental, starting at the soles of his hobnail boots and exploding right in my face. I hadn't realized how vulnerable I was, with the farmer leaning over the calf's neck, his head a few inches from mine. He repeated, and a second shower of virus-laden moisture struck me. Apparently Mr. Sowden either didn't know or didn't care about droplet infection, but with my hands inside my patient there was nothing I could do about it. Instinctively I turned my face a little in the other direction. Went George. It was a sneeze rather than a cough, but it sent a similar deadly spray against my other cheek. I realized I was hopelessly trapped between the two of them. But, as I say, my morale had received a boost. Eagerly I scooped out great handfuls of the offending fruit, and within minutes the floor of the barn was littered with Bramley's seedlings and conference pears. "Enough here to start a shop," I laughed. Responded Mr. Sowden. Added George, not to be outdone. When I had sent the last apple and pear rolling into the darkness, I scrubbed up again and started to stitch. This is the longest and most wearisome part of the ruminotomy. The excitement of diagnosis and discovery is over, and it is a good time for idle chat, funny stories, anything to pass the time. But there in the circle of yellow light, with the wind whirling round my feet from the surrounding gloom, and occasional icy trickles of rain running down my back, I was singularly short of gossip, and my companions, sunk in their respective miseries, were in no mood for badinage. I was halfway down the skin sutures when a trickle mounted at the back of my nose and I had to stop and stand upright. I rubbed my forearm along my nose. "He's starting," murmured George with mournful satisfaction. "Aye, he's off," agreed Mr. Sowden, brightening visibly. I was not greatly worried. I had long since come to the conclusion that my cause was lost. The long session of freezing in my shirt sleeves would have done it, without the incessant germ bombardment from either side. I was resigned to my fate, and besides, when I inserted the last stitch and helped the calf down from that table, I felt a deep thrill of satisfaction. That horrible groan had vanished, and the little animal was looking around him as though he had been away for a while. He wasn't cheerful yet, but I knew his pain had gone, and that he would live. "Bed him up well, Mr. Sowden." I started to wash my instruments in the bucket. "And put a couple of sacks round him to keep him warm. I'll call in a fortnight to take out the stitches." A fortnight seemed to last a long time. My cold, as I had confidently expected, developed into a raging holocaust, which settled down into the inevitable bronchitis with an accompanying cough which rivalled Mr. Sowden's. Mr. Sowden was never an ebullient man, but I expected him to look a little happier when I removed the stitches. Because the calf was bright and lively, I had to chase him round his pen to catch him. Despite the fire in my chest, I had that airy feeling of success. "Well," I said expansively, "he's done very well. He'll make a good bullock some day." The farmer shrugged gloomily. "I reckon he will, but there was no need for all that carry-on." "No need?" "No. I've been talking to one or two folk about the job, and all said it was daft to open him up like that. I should have just given him a pint of oil, like I said." "Mr. Sowden, I assure you—" "And now I'll have a big bill to pay." He dug his hands deep into his pockets. "Believe me, it was worth it." "Nay, nay, never." He started to walk away, then looked over his shoulder. "It would have been better if you hadn't come." I had done 3 circuits with Fight Officer Woodham, and on this third one he had kept fairly quiet. Obviously, I was doing all right now, and I could start enjoying myself again. Flying was lovely. The voice came over the intercom again. "I'm going to let you land her yourself this time. I've told you how to do it. Right. You've got her." "I've got her," I replied. He had indeed told me how to do it, again and again, and I was sure I would have no trouble. As we lost height, the tops of the trees appeared, then the grass of the airfield came up to meet us. It was the moment of truth. Carefully, I eased the stick back. Then at what I thought was the right moment, I slammed it back against my stomach. Maybe a bit soon, because we bounced a couple of times, and that made me forget to seesaw the rudder bar, so that we careered from side to side over the turf before coming to a halt. When the engine stilled, I took a deep breath. That was my first landing, and it hadn't been bad. In fact, I had got better and better all the time, and the conviction was growing in me that my instructor must have been impressed with my initial showing. We climbed out, and after walking a few steps in silence, Flight Officer Woodham halted and turned to me. "What's your name?" he asked. Ah, yes, here was the proof. He knew I had done well. He was interested in me. "Herriot, sir," I replied smartly. For a few moments he gave me a level stare. "Well, Herriot," he murmured, "that was bloody awful." He turned and left me. I gazed down at my feet in their big sheepskin boots. Yes, the uniform was different, but things hadn't changed all that much. Chapter 29. Takes all kinds, doesn't it, chum? The airman grinned at me across the flight hut table. We had been listening to a monologue from a third man who had just left us after telling us what he intended to do after gaining his wings. The impression he left was that he was almost going to win the war on his own. There were certainly all kinds in the RAF, and this line shooting was a common phenomenon when different types were thrown together. There were all kinds of animals, too. Many people think my farm patients are all the same, but cows, pigs, sheep, and horses can be moody, placid, vicious, docile, spiteful, loving. There was one particular pig called Gertrude, but before I come to her, I must start with Mr. Barge. Nowadays, the young men from the pharmaceutical companies who call on veterinary surgeons are referred to as reps, but nobody would have dreamt of applying such a term to Mr. Barge. He was definitely a representative of Cargill and Sons, manufacturers of fine chemicals since 1850, and he was so old that he might have been in on the beginning. It was a frosty morning in late winter when I opened the front door at Skeldale House and saw Mr. Barge standing on the front step. He raised his black Homburg a few inches above the sparse strands of silver hair, and his pink features relaxed into a smile of gentle benevolence. He had always treated me as a favourite son, and I took it as a compliment because he was a man of immense prestige. "Mr. Herriot," he murmured, and bowed slightly. The bow was rich in dignity, and matched the dark morning coat, striped trousers, and shiny leather briefcase. "Please come in, Mr. Barge," I said, and ushered him into the house. He always called at midday and stayed for lunch. My young boss, Siegfried Fahnen, a man not easily overawed, invariably treated him with deference, and in fact the visit was something of a state occasion. The modern rep breezes in, chats briefly about blood levels of antibiotics and steroids, says a word or two about bulk discounts, drops a few data sheets on the desk, and hurries away. In a way, I feel rather sorry for these young men because, with a few exceptions, they are all selling the same thing. Mr. Barge, on the other hand, like all his contemporaries, carried a thick catalogue of exotic remedies, each one peculiar to its own firm. Siegfried pulled out the chair at the head of the dining table. "Come and sit here, Mr. Barge." "You are very kind." The old gentleman inclined his head slightly and took his place. As usual, there was no reference to business during the meal, and it wasn't until the coffee appeared that Mr. Barge dropped his brochure carelessly on the table, as though this part of the visit was an unimportant afterthought. Siegfried and I browsed through the pages, savouring the exciting whiff of witchcraft which had been blown from our profession by the wind of science. At intervals, my boss placed an order. "I think we'd better have a couple of dozen lecturers, Mr. Barge." "Thank you so much." The old gentleman flipped open a leather-bound notebook and made an entry with a silver pencil. "And we're getting a bit low on fever drinks, aren't we, James?" Siegfried glanced round at me. "Yes. We'll need a gross of them, if you please." "I am most grateful," Mr. Barge breathed, noting that down too. My employer murmured his requests as he riffled through the catalogue. A Winchester of spirits of nitre, and another of formalin, castration clams, triple bromide, Stockholm tar, all the things we never use now, and Mr. Barge responded gravely to each one with, "I do thank you," or "Thank you indeed," and a flourish of his silver pencil. Finally, Siegfried lay back in his chair. "Well now, Mr. Barge, I think that's it. Unless you have anything new?" "As it happens, my dear Mr. Fahnen, we have." The eyes in the pink face twinkled. "I can offer you our latest product, Soothe It, an admirable sedative." In an instant, Siegfried and I were all attention. Every animal doctor is keenly interested in sedatives. Anything which makes our patients more amenable is a blessing. Mr. Barge extolled the unique properties of Soothe It, and we probed for further information. "How about unmaternal sows?" I asked. "You know, the kind which savage their young. I don't suppose it's any good for that." "My dear young sir." Mr. Barge gave me the kind of sorrowing smile a bishop might bestow on an erring curate. "Soothe It is a specific for this condition. A single injection to a farrowing sow, and you will have no problems." "Oh, that's great," I said. "And does it have any effect on car sickness in dogs?" The noble old features lit up with quiet triumph. "Another classical indication, Mr. Herriot. Soothe It comes in tablet form for that very purpose." "Splendid!" Siegfried drained his cup and stood up. "Better send us a good supply, then. And if you will excuse us, we must start the afternoon round, Mr. Barge. Thank you so much for calling." We all shook hands. Mr. Barge raised his Homburg again on the front step, and another gracious occasion was over. Within a week, the new supplies from Cargill and Sons arrived. Medicines were always sent in tea chests in those days, and as I prized open the wooden lid, I looked with interest at the beautifully packed phials and tablets of Soothe It, and it seemed uncanny that I had a call for the new product immediately. That same day, one of the town's bank managers, Mr. Ronald Beresford, called to see me. "Mr. Herriot," he said, "as you know, I have worked here for several years, but I have been offered the managership of a larger branch down south, and I leave tomorrow for Portsmouth." From his gaunt height he looked down at me with the unsmiling gaze which was characteristic of him. "Portsmouth? Gosh, that's a long way." "Yes, it is. About 300 miles. And I have a problem." "Really?" "I have, I fear. I recently purchased a 6-month-old Cocker Spaniel, and he is an excellent little animal, but for the fact that he behaves peculiarly in the car." "In what way?" He hesitated. "Well, he's outside now. If you've got a minute to spare, I could demonstrate." "Of course," I said. "I'll come with you now." We went out to the car. His wife was in the passenger seat, as fat as her husband was thin, but with the same severe, unbending manner. She nodded at me coldly, but the attractive little animal on her lap gave me an enthusiastic welcome. I stroked the long, silky ears. "He's a nice little fella." Mr. Beresford gave me a sidelong glance. "Yes, his name is Coco, and he really is quite charming. It's only when the engine is running that the trouble begins." I got in the back, he pressed the starter, and we set off. And I saw immediately what he meant. The spaniel stiffened and raised his head till his nose pointed at the roof. He formed his lips into a cone and emitted a series of high-pitched howls. "Ow! Yow! Wow! Wow!" wailed Coco. It really startled me because I'd never heard anything quite like it. I don't know whether it was the perfectly even spacing of the hoots, their piercing, jarring quality, or the fact that they never stopped, which drove the sound deep into my brain. But my head was singing after a 2-minute circuit of the town. I was vastly relieved when we drew up again outside the surgery. Mr. Beresford switched off the engine, and it was as though he had switched off the noise too, because the little animal relaxed instantly and began to lick my hand. "Yes," I said. "You have a problem, without a doubt." He pulled nervously at his tie. "And it gets louder the longer you drive." "Let me take you a bit further round, and—" No, I put in hastily. "That won't be necessary. I can see exactly how you are placed. But you say you haven't had Coco for long." "Well, he isn't much more than a pup. I'm sure he'll get used to the car in time." "Well, very possibly he will." Mr. Beresford's voice was taut with apprehension. "But I'm thinking of tomorrow. I've got to drive all the way to Portsmouth with my wife and this dog, and I've tried car sickness tablets without result." A full day with that appalling din was unthinkable. But at that moment the image of Mr. Barge rose before me. He had sprouted wings and floated in front of my eyes like an elderly guardian angel. What an incredible piece of luck! "As it happens," I said with a reassuring smile, "there is something new for this sort of thing, and by coincidence we have just received a batch of it today. Come in and I'll fix you up." "Well, thank heavens for that." Mr. Beresford examined the box of tablets. "I just give one, half an hour before the journey, and all will be well?" "That's the idea," I replied cheerfully. "I've given you a few extra for future journeys." "I am most grateful. You've taken a great load off my mind." He went out to the car, and I watched as he started the engine. As if in response to a signal, the little brown head on the back seat went up and the lips pursed. "Yow! Yow! Yow! Yow!" Coco yowled, and his master shot me a despairing look as he drove away. I stood on the steps for some time, listening incredulously. Many people in Danby didn't like Mr. Beresford very much, probably because of his cold manner, but I felt he wasn't a bad chap, and he certainly had my sympathy. Long after the car had disappeared round the corner of Trengate, I could still hear Coco. "Yow! Yow! Yow! Yow!" About 7 o'clock that evening, I had a phone call from Will Hollin. "Gertrude started farrowing," he said urgently, "and she's trying to worry her pigs." It was bad news. Sows occasionally attacked their piglets after birth, and in fact would kill them if they were not removed from their reach. And of course it meant that suckling was impossible. It was a tricky problem at any time, but particularly so in this case because Gertrude was a pedigree sow, an expensive animal Will Hollin had bought to improve his strain of pigs. "How many has she had?" I asked. "4, and she's gone for every one." His voice was tense. It was then I remembered Soothe It, and again I blessed the coming of Mr. Barge. I smiled into the receiver. "There's a new product I can use, Mr. Hollin. Just arrived today. I'll be right out." I trotted through to the dispensary, opened the box of files, and had a quick read at the enclosed pamphlet. Ah, yes, there it was. 10 cc intramuscularly, and the sow will accept the piglets within 20 minutes. It wasn't a long drive to the Hollin farm, but as I sped through the darkness, I could discern the workings of fate in the day's events. The Soothed had arrived this morning, and right away I had 2 urgent calls for it. There was no doubt Mr. Barge had been sent for a purpose. Living proof, perhaps, that everything in our lives is preordained. It gave me a prickling at the back of my neck to think about it. I could hardly wait to get the injection into the sow and climbed eagerly into the pen. Gertrude didn't appreciate having a needle rammed into her thigh, and she swung round on me with an explosive bark. But I got the 10 cc in before making my escape. "We just wait 20 minutes, then?" Will Hollin leant on the rail and looked down anxiously at his pig. He was a hard-working smallholder in his 50s, and I knew this meant a lot to him. I was about to make a comforting reply when Gertrude popped out another pink, squirming piglet. The farmer leant over and gently nudged the little creature towards the udder as the sow lay on her side. But as soon as the nose made contact with the teat, the big pig was up in a flash, all growls and yellow teeth. He snatched the piglet away quickly and deposited it with the others in a tall cardboard box. "Well, you see how it is, Mr. Herriot." "I certainly do. How many have you got in there now?" There's 6. They're grand pigs, too." I peered into the box at the little animals. They all had the classical long-bodied shape. "Yes, they are. And she looks as though she has a lot more in her yet." The farmer nodded, and we waited. It seemed to take a long time for the 20 minutes to pass, but finally I lifted a couple of the piglets and clambered into the pen. I was about to put them to the sow when one of them squealed. Gertrude rushed across with a ferocious roar, mouth gaping, and I leapt to safety with an agility which surprised me. "She don't look very sleepy," Mr. Hollin said. "No. No, she doesn't, does she? Maybe we'd better wait a bit longer." We gave her another 10 minutes and tried again with the same result. I injected a further 10 c of the Soothed, then about an hour later a third one. By 9 o'clock, Gertrude had produced 15 beautiful young pigs and had chased me and her family from the pen 6 times. She was, if anything, livelier and fiercer than when I started. "Well, she's cleansed," Mr. Hollin said gloomily, "so it looks like she's finished." He gazed, sad-faced, into the box. "And now I've got 15 pigs to rear without their mother's milk. I could lose all this lot." "Nay, nay," the voice came from the open doorway. "You won't lose 'em." I looked round. It was Grandad Hollin, his puckish features set in their customary smile. He marched to the pen and poked Gertrude's ribs with his stick. She responded with a snarl and a malignant glare, and the old man's smile grew broader. "I'll soon fettle the old beggar," he said. "Fettle her?" I shifted my feet uncomfortably. "What do you mean?" "Why, she just wants quieting, thou knows." I took a long breath. "Yes, Mr. Hollin, that's exactly what I've been trying to do." "Aye, but you're not doing it the right way, young man." I looked at him narrowly. The know-all, with his liberal advice in a difficult situation, is a familiar figure most veterinary surgeons have to tolerate. But in Grandad Hollin's case, I didn't feel the usual irritation. I liked him. He was a nice man, the head of a fine family. Will was the eldest of his 4 sons, and he had several farmer grandsons in the district. Anyway, I had failed miserably. I was in no position to be uppity. "Well, I've given her the latest injection," I mumbled. He shook his head. "She don't want injections. She wants beer." "Eh?" "Beer, young man. A drop of good ale." He turned to his son. "Hast thou got a clean bucket, Will, lad?" "Aye, there's a new scalded one at Milkhouse." "Right, I'll slip down to the pub. Won't be long." Grandad swung on his heel and strode briskly into the night. He must have been around 80, but from the back he looked like a 25-year-old, upright, square-shouldered, jaunty. Will Hollin and I didn't have much to say to each other. He was sunk in disappointment, and I was awash with shame. It was a relief when Grandad returned bearing an enamel bucket brimming with brown liquid. "By God!" he chortled. "You should have seen their faces down at Wagon and Horses. Reckon they'd never heard of a 2-gallon order afore." I gaped at him. "You've got 2 gallons of beer?" That's right, young man, and she'll need it all. He turned again to his son. She hasn't had a drink for a bit, has she, Will? No, I was going to give her some water when she finished pigging, but I haven't done it yet. Grandad poised his bucket. She'll be nice and thirsty then. He leant over the rail and sent a dark cascade frothing into the empty trough. Gertrude ambled moodily across and sniffed at the strange fluid. After some hesitation, she dipped her snout and tried a tentative swallow, and within seconds the building echoed with a busy slobbering. "By heck, she likes it," Will exclaimed. "She should," Grandad murmured wistfully. "It's John Smith's best bitter." It took the sow a surprisingly short time to consume the 2 gallons, and when she had finished she looked out every corner of the trough before turning away. She showed no inclination to return to her straw bed, but began to saunter round the pen. Now and then she stopped at the trough to check that there was no more beer in it, and from time to time she looked up at the 3 faces overhanging the timber walls. On one of these occasions I caught her eye, and saw with a sense of disbelief that the previously baleful little orb now registered only a gentle benevolence. In fact, with a little effort I could have imagined she was smiling. As the minutes passed, her perambulations became increasingly erratic. There were times when she stumbled and almost fell, and finally, with an unmistakable hiccup, she flopped on the straw and rolled onto her side. Grandad regarded her expressionlessly for a few moments, whistling tunelessly. Then he reached out again and pushed his stick against the fleshy thigh, but the only response he received from the motionless animal was a soft grunt of pleasure. Gertrude was stoned to the wide. The old man gestured towards the cardboard box. "Put the little uns in now." Will went into the pen with a wriggling animal, then another, and like all newborn creatures they didn't have to be told what to do. 15 ravenous little mouths fastened onto the teats, and with mixed feelings I gazed at the sight which I'd hoped to bring about with my modern veterinary skill, the long pink row filling their tiny stomachs with the life-giving fluid. Well, I had fallen down on the job, and an octogenarian farmer had wiped my eye with 2 gallons of strong ale. I didn't feel great. Sheepishly, I closed the box of Soothit files and was beating an unobtrusive retreat to my car when Will Hollin called after me. "Come on in and have a cup of tea before you go, Mr. Herriot." His voice was friendly, with nothing to suggest that I had made no useful contribution all evening. I made my way into the kitchen, and as I went over to the table, Will dug me in the ribs. "Hey, look at this." He held out the bucket in which a quantity of the good beer still sloshed around the bottom. "There's somewhat better than coffee here. Enough for a couple of good drinks. I'll get 2 glasses." He was fumbling in the dresser when Grandad walked in. The old man hung his hat and stick on a hook on the wall and rubbed his hands. "I can get another glass out, Will," he said. "Remember, I did the pouring, and I left enough for 3. Next morning I might have been inclined to dwell despondently on my chastening experience, but I had a pre-breakfast call to a cow with a prolapsed uterus, and there is nothing like an hour of feverish activity to rid the mind of brooding. It was 8 a.m. when I drove back into Darrowby, and I pulled into the Marketplace petrol station, which was just opening. With a pleasantly blank mind, I was watching Bob Cooper running the petrol in the tank when I heard the sound in the distance. "Wow! Wow! Wow! Wow!" Tremblingly, I scanned the square. There was no other vehicle in sight. But the dread ululation approached inexorably, until Mr. Beresford's car rounded the far corner, heading my way. I shrank behind a petrol pump, but it was of no avail. I had been spotted, and the car bumped over the strip of cobbles before screeching to a halt beside me. "Ow! Ow! Ow! Ow!" At close quarters the noise was insupportable. I peeped round the pump and into the bulging eyes of the bank manager as he lowered his window. He switched off the engine, and Coco stopped his howling and gave me a friendly wag through the glass. His master, however, did not look at all friendly. "Good morning, Mr. Herriot," he said, grim-faced. "Good morning," I replied hoarsely, then working up a smile I bent at the window. "And good morning to you, Mrs. Beresford." The lady withered me with a look, and was about to speak when her husband went on. "I administered one of the wonderful new tablets early this morning on your advice." His chin quivered slightly. "Oh, yes. Yes, I did. and it had no effect, so I gave him another. He paused. Since this produced a similar result, I tried a third, and a fourth. I swallowed. Really? Indeed. He gave me a cold stare. So I am driven to the conclusion that the tablets are useless. Well, it certainly does look— He held up a hand. I cannot listen to explanations. I have already wasted enough time, and there are 300 miles driving in front of me. I'm truly sorry, I began, but he was already closing the window. He started the engine, and Coco froze immediately into his miniature wolf position, nose high, lips puckered into a small circle. I watched the car roll across the square and turn out of sight on the road to the south. For quite a while after it had gone, I could still hear Coco. "Ow! Ow! Ow! Ow!" Feeling suddenly weak, I leant against the pump. My heart went out to Mr. Beresford. As I have said, I felt sure he was a decent man. In fact, I quite liked him. But for all that, I was profoundly grateful that I would probably never see him again. Our audiences with Mr. Barge usually took place every 3 months, and it was mid-June before I saw him again at the head of our luncheon table. The silvery head gleamed under the summer sunshine as he sipped his coffee and murmured politenesses. At the end of the meal, he dabbed his lips with a napkin and slid his brochure unhurriedly along the tablecloth. Siegfried reached for it and asked the inevitable question, "Anything new, Mr. Barge?" "My dear sir." The old gentleman's smile seemed to convey that the follies of the young, though incomprehensible to him, were still delightful. "Cargill & Sons never send me to you without a host of new products, many of them specific, all of them efficient. I have many sovereign remedies to offer you." I must have uttered some sort of strangled sound because he turned and regarded me quizzically. "Ah, Mr. Herriot, did you say something, young sir?" I swallowed a couple of times and opened my mouth as the waves of benevolence flowed over me, but against that dignity and presence I was helpless. No, not really, Mr. Barge," I replied. I knew I would never be able to tell him about the Soothit. Chapter 30. Now that we were faced with the reality of life at flying school, the ties which bound me to my fellow airmen were strengthened. We had a common aim, a common worry. The feeling of comradeship was very much like my relationship with Siegfried and his student brother Tristan back in Darrowby. But there the pressures came not from learning to fly, but from the daily challenge of veterinary practice. Our existence was ruled by sudden and unexpected alarms. Tristan, however, didn't let it get him down. He and I were sitting in the big room at Scaledale House one night when the telephone burst into strident voice. He reached from his chair and lifted the receiver. "Hello, please. Who is this?" he inquired. He listened attentively for a few moments, then shook his head. No, very sorry, but Mr. Farnan no at home. Yes, I tell him when he come. Okie dokie, bye-bye." I looked across at him wonderingly from the other side of the fireplace as he replaced the instrument. These strange accents were only one facet of his constant determination to extract amusement from every situation. He didn't do it all the time, only when the mood was on him. But it was not unusual for farmers to say that some foreign fella had answered the phone. Tristan settled comfortably behind his daily mirror and was fumbling for a woodbine when the ringing started again. He stretched out once more. Yes, good evening. How do you do? What do you want, huh? I could just hear a deep rumble from the other end of the line, and Tristan suddenly snapped upright in his chair. His daily mirror and cigarettes slithered to the floor. "Yes, Mr. Mount," he said smartly. "No, Mr. Mount. Yes, indeed, Mr. Mount. I shall pass on your message immediately. Thank you very much. Goodbye." He fell back in the chair and blew out his cheeks. That was Mr. Mount. So I gathered. And he certainly wiped the smile off your face, Tris. Yes, just a little unexpected. He recovered his woodbines and lit one thoughtfully. "Quite," I said. "What did he ring for, anyway?" "Oh, he has a cart horse to see tomorrow morning. Something wrong with its hind feet?" I made a note on the pad and turned back to the young man. "I don't know how you find the time in your hectic love life, but you're running around with that chap's daughter, are you?" Tristan took the cigarette from his mouth and studied the glowing end. "Yes, as a matter of fact, I have taken Deborah Mount out a few times. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no particular reason. Her old man seems a bit formidable, that's all." I could picture Mr. Mount the last time I saw him. He was well named. A veritable massif of a man, towering several inches over 6 feet. From shoulders, like the great buttresses of the fell which overhung his farm, rose a beetling cliff of head with craggy outcrops of jaw and cheek and brow. He had the biggest hands I had ever seen, approximately 3 times the size of my own. "Oh, I don't know," Tristan said. "He's not a bad sort." "Oh, I agree. I have nothing against him." Mr. Mount was deeply religious and had the reputation of being hard but fair. "It's just that I wouldn't like him to come up to me and ask if I was trifling with his daughter's affections." Tristan swallowed, and anxiety flitted briefly in his eyes. "Oh, that's ridiculous. Deborah and I have a friendly relationship, that's all." "Well, I'm glad to hear it," I said. "I've been told her father is very protective about her, and I'd hate to feel those big hands around my throat." Tristan gave me a cold stare. "You're a sadistic bugger at times, Jim." "Just because I occasionally enjoy a little female company." "Oh, forget it, Tris. I'm only kidding." "You've nothing to worry about. When I see old Mount tomorrow, I promise I won't mention that Deborah is one of your harem." I dodged the flying cushion and went through to the dispensary to stock up for the next day's round. But I realized next morning that my joke was barbed when I saw Mr. Mount coming out of the farmhouse. For a moment his bulk filled the doorway. Then he advanced with measured tread over the cobbles till he loomed over me, blocking out the sunshine, throwing a large area around me into shade. "That young man, Tristan," he said without preamble. "He was speaking a bit funny-like on the phone last night. What sort of feller is he?" I looked up at the great head poised above me, at the unwavering grey eyes probing into mine from beneath a bristling overhang of brow. "Tristan?" I answered shakily. "Oh, he's a splendid chap. A really fine type." The huge man continued to look at me, and one banana-like finger rubbed doubtfully along his chin. "Does he drink?" Mr. Mount was renowned for his rigid antagonism to alcohol, and I thought it unwise to reply that Tristan was a popular and esteemed figure at most of the local hostelries. "Oh, I said, hardly at all. In the strictest moderation." At that moment, Deborah came out of the house and began to walk across the yard. She was wearing a flowered cotton dress. About 19, shining golden hair falling below her shoulders, she radiated the healthy, buxom beauty of the country girl. As she went by, she flashed a smile at me, and I had a heart-lifting glimpse of white teeth and warm brown eyes. It was in the early days before I had met Helen, and I had as sharp an interest in a pretty lass as anybody. I found myself studying her legs appreciatively after she had passed. It was then that I had an almost palpable awareness of her father's gaze upon me. I turned and saw a new expression there, a harsh disapproval which chilled me and left a deep conviction in my mind. Deborah was a little smasher, all right, and she looked nice too, but no, never. Tristan had more courage than I had. Mr. Mount turned away abruptly. "This oss is in the stable," he grunted. In those late 30s, the tractor had driven a lot of the draft horses from the land, but most of the farmers kept a few around, perhaps because they had always worked horses and it was part of their way of life, and maybe because of the sheer, proud beauty of animals like the one which stood before me now. It was a magnificent Shire gelding, standing all of 18 hands. He was a picture of massively muscled power, but when his master spoke, the great white-blazed face which turned to us was utterly docile. The farmer slapped him on the rump. "He's a good sort, is Bobby, and I think a bit about him." What I noticed first was a strange smell about his hind feet. Then I had a look for myself. I've never seen aught like it. I bent and seized a handful of the long, feathered hair behind the horse's pastern. Bobby did not resist as I lifted the huge, spatulate foot and rested it on my knee. It seemed to occupy most of my lap, But it was not the size which astonished me. Mr. Mount had never seen aught like it, and neither had I. The sole was a ragged, sodden mass with a stinking exudation oozing from the underrun horn. But what really bewildered me was the series of growths sprouting from every crevice. They were like nightmare toadstools, long papillae with horny caps growing from the diseased surface. I had read about them in the books. They were called ergots, but I had never imagined them in such profusion. My thoughts raced as I moved behind the horse and lifted the other foot. It was just the same, just as bad. I had been qualified only a few months and was still trying to gain the confidence of the Darrowby farmers. This was just the sort of thing I didn't want. "What is it?" Mr. Mount asked, and again I felt that unwinking gaze piercing me. I straightened up and rubbed my hands. "It's canker, but a very bad case." I knew all about the theory of the thing. In fact, I was bursting with theory. But putting it into practice with this animal was a bit different. "How are we going to cure it?" Mr. Mount had an uncomfortable habit of going straight to the heart of things. "Well, you see, all that loose horn and those growths will have to be cut away, and then the surface dressed with caustic," I replied. And it sounded easy when I said it. "It won't get better on its own, then?" "No, if you leave it, the sole will disintegrate and the pedal bone will come through. Also, the discharge will work up under the wall of the hoof and cause separation." The farmer nodded. "So she'd never walk again, and that would be the end of Bobby?" "I'm afraid so." "Right then." Mr. Mount threw up his head with a decisive gesture. "When are you going to do it?" It was a nasty question, because I was preoccupied at that moment not so much with when I would do it, but how I would do it. "Well now, let's see," I said huskily. "Would it be—" The farmer broke in. "We're busy hay-making all this week, and you'll be wanting some men to help you. How about Monday next week?" A wave of relief surged through me. Thank heavens he hadn't said tomorrow. I had a bit of time to think now. "Very well, Mr. Mount, that suits me fine. Don't feed him on the Sunday, because he'll have to have an anaesthetic." Driving from the farm, a sense of doom oppressed me. Was I going to ruin that beautiful animal in my ignorance? Canker of the foot was unpleasant at any time, and was not uncommon in the days of the draught horse, but this was something way out of the ordinary. No doubt many of my contemporaries had seen feet like Bobby's, but to the modern young veterinary surgeon it must be like a page from an ancient manual of farriery. As is my wont when I have a worrying case, I started mulling it over right away. As I drove, I rehearsed various procedures. Would that enormous horse go down with a chloroform muzzle? Or would I have to collect all Mr. Mount's men and rope him and pull him down? But it would be like trying to pull down St. Paul's Cathedral. And then, how long would it take me to hack away all that horn? All those dreadful vegetations? Within 10 minutes my palms were sweating and I was tempted to throw the whole lot over to Siegfried. But I was restrained by the knowledge that I had to establish myself, not only with the farmers, but with my new boss. He wasn't going to think much of an assistant who couldn't handle a thing on his own. I did what I usually did when I was worried. Drove off the unfenced road, got out of the car, and followed a track across the moor. The track wound beneath the brow of the fell which overlooked the Mount farm, and when I had left the road far behind, I flopped on the grass and looked down on the sunlit valley 1,000 feet below. In most places you could hear something, the call of a bird, a car in the distance. But here there was a silence which was absolute, except when the wind sighed over the hilltop, rustling the bracken around me. The farm lay in one of the soft places in a harsh countryside. Lush, flat fields where cattle grazed in comfort, and the cut hay lay in long, even swathes. It was a placid scene, but it was up here, in the airy heights, you found true serenity. Peace dwelt here in the high moorland, stealing across the empty miles, breathing from the silence and the tufted grass and the black, peaty earth. The heady fragrance of the bay rose in the warm summer air, and as always I felt my troubles dissolving. Even now, after all the years, I still count myself lucky that I can so often find tranquillity of mind in the high places. As I rose to go, I was filled with a calm resolve. I would do the job somehow. Surely I could manage the thing without troubling Siegfried. In any case, Siegfried had other things on his mind when I met him over the lunch table. "I looked in at Granville Bennett's surgery at Hartington this morning," he said, helping himself to some new potatoes which had been picked that morning from the garden. "And I must say I was very impressed with his waiting room. All those magazines. I know we don't have the numbers to cater for, but there's often a lot of farmers in there." He poured gravy onto a corner of his plate. "Tristan, I'll give you the job. Slip round to Garlow's and order a few suitable things to be delivered every week, will you?" "OK," his student brother replied. "I'll do it this afternoon." "Splendid." Siegfried chewed happily. "We must keep progressing in every way. Do have some more of these potatoes, James. They really are very good." Tristan went into action right away, and within 2 days the table and shelves in our waiting room carried a tasteful selection of periodicals: the Illustrated London News, Farmer's Weekly, the Farmer and Stock Breeder, Punch. But as usual, he had to embroider the situation. "Look at this, Jim," he whispered one afternoon, guiding me through the door. "I've been having a little harmless sport." "What do you mean?" I looked around me uncomprehendingly. Tristan said nothing, but pointed to one of the shelves. There, among the innocent journals, was a German naturist magazine displaying a startling frontispiece of full frontal nudity. Even in these permissive days it would have caused a raised eyebrow, but in rural Yorkshire in the 30s, it was cataclysmic. "Where the devil did you get this?" I gasped, leafing through it hurriedly. It was just the same inside. "And what's the idea, anyway?" Tristan repressed a giggle. "A fellow at college gave it to me, and it's rather a lark to sneak in quietly and find some solid citizen having a peek when he thinks nobody's looking. I've had some very successful incursions. My best bags so far have been a town councillor, a justice of the peace, and a lay preacher." I shook my head. "I think you're sticking your neck out. What if Siegfried comes across it?" "No fear of that," he said. "He rarely comes in here, and he's always in too much of a hurry. Anyway, it's well out of the way." I shrugged. Tristan had been blessed with an agile intelligence which I envied, but so much of it was misapplied. However, at the moment, I hadn't time for his tricks. My mind was feverishly preoccupied. Mentally, I had cast that horse by innumerable methods, and operated on his feet 1,000 times by night and day. In daylight, riding round in the car, it wasn't so bad, but the operations I carried out in bed were truly bizarre. All the time I had the feeling that something was wrong, that there was some fatal flaw in the picture of myself carving away those hideous growths in one session. Finally, I buried my pride. "Siegfried," I said one afternoon when the practice was slack, "I have a rather weird horse case." My boss's eyes glinted, and the mouth beneath the small sandy moustache crooked into a smile. The word horse usually had this effect. "Really, James? Tell me." I told him. "Yes, yes," he murmured. "Maybe we'd better have a look together." The Mount Farm was deserted when we arrived. Everybody was in the hayfields working frantically while the sunshine lasted. "Where is he?" Siegfried asked. "In here." I led the way to the stable. My boss lifted a hind foot and whistled softly. Then he moved round and examined the other one. For a full minute he gazed down at the obscene fungi thrusting from the tattered, stinking horn. When he stood up, he looked at me expressionlessly. It was a few seconds before he spoke. "And you were just going to pop round here on Monday, tip this big fellow onto the grass, and do the job?" "Yes," I replied. "That was the idea." A strange smile spread over my employer's face. It held something of wonder, sympathy, amusement, and a tinge of admiration. Finally he laughed and shook his head. "The innocence of youth," he murmured. "What do you mean? After all, I was only 6 years younger than Siegfried." He came over and patted my shoulder. "I'm not mocking you, James. This is the worst case of canker I've ever seen, and I've seen a few." "You mean I couldn't do it at one go?" "That's exactly what I mean. There's 6 weeks' work here, James." 6 weeks? "Yes, and there'll be 3 men involved. We'll have to get this horse into one of the loose boxes at Skeldale House, and then the 2 of us plus a blacksmith will have a go at him. After that, his feet will have to be dressed every day in the stocks." "I see. Yes. Yes, Siegfried was warming to his subject. We'll use the strongest caustic, nitric acid, and he'll be shod with special shoes with a metal plate to exert pressure on the sole. He stopped, probably because I was beginning to look bewildered. Then he continued in a gentler tone. Believe me, James, all this is necessary. The alternative is to shoot a fine horse, because he can't go on much longer like this. I looked at Bobby, at the white face again turned towards us. The thought of a bullet entering that noble head was unbearable. "All right, whatever you say, Siegfried," I mumbled, and just then Mr. Mount's vast bulk darkened the entrance to the stable. "Ah, good afternoon to you, Mr. Mount," my boss said. "I hope you're getting a good crop of hay." "Aye, thank you, Mr. Farnham. We're doing very nicely. We've been lucky with the weather." The big man looked curiously from one of us to the other, and Siegfried went on quickly. "Mr. Herriot asked me to come and look at your horse. He's been thinking the matter over and has decided that it would be better to hospitalize him at our place for a few weeks. I must say I agree with him. It's a very bad case, and the chances of a permanent cure would be increased." Bless you, Siegfried, I thought. I'd expected to emerge from this meeting as the #1 chump, but all was suddenly well. I congratulated myself, not for the first time, on having an employer who never let me down. Mr. Mount took off his hat and drew a forearm across his sweating brow. "Ah, well, if that's what you think, both of you, we'd better do it. I want the best for Bobby. He's a favourite of mine. Yes, he's a grand sort, Mr. Mount." Siegfried went round the big animal, patting and stroking him. Then, as we walked back to the car, he kept up an effortless conversation with the farmer. I had always found it difficult to speak to this formidable man, but in my colleague's presence he had become quite chatty. In fact, there were 1 or 2 occasions when he almost smiled. Bobby came into the yard at Scaledale House the following day, and when I saw the amount of sheer hard labour which the operation entailed, I realised the utter impossibility of a single man doing it in one go. Pat Jenner, the blacksmith, with his full tool-kit, was pressed into service, and between us, taking it in turns, we removed all the vegetations and diseased tissue, leaving only healthy horn. Siegfried applied the acid to cauterize the area, then packed the sole with twists of toe, which were held in place by the metal plate Pat had made to fit under the shoe. This pressure from the toe was essential to effect a cure. After a week, I was doing the daily dressings myself. This was when I began to appreciate the value of the stocks, with their massive timbers sunk deep into the cobbles of the yard. It made everything so much easier when I was able to lead Bobby into the stocks, pull up a foot, and make it fast in any position I wished. Some days Pat Jenner came in to check on the shoes, and he and I were busy in the yard when I heard the familiar rattle of my little Austin in the back lane. The big double doors were open, and I looked up as the car turned in and drew alongside us. Pat looked too, and his eyes popped. "Bloody hell!" he exclaimed, and I couldn't blame him, because the car had no driver. At least it looked that way, since there was nobody in the seat as it swung in from the lane. A driverless car in motion is quite a sight, and Pat gaped open-mouthed for a few seconds. Then, just as I was about to explain, Tristan shot up from the floor with a piercing cry. "Hi there!" he shrieked. Pat dropped his hammer and backed away. "God help us," he breathed. I was unaffected by the performance because it was old stuff to me. Whenever I was in the yard and a call came in, Tristan would drive my car round from the front street, and this happened so many times that, inevitably, he grew bored and tried to find a less orthodox method. After a bit of practice, he mastered the driverless technique. He crouched on the floor with a foot on the accelerator and one hand on the wheel, and nearly frightened the life out of me the first time he did it. But I was used to it now, and blasé. Within a few days, I was able to observe another of Tristan's little jokes. As I turned the corner of the passage at Scaledale House, I found him lurking by the waiting-room door, which was slightly ajar. "I think I've got a victim in there," he whispered. "Let's see what happens." He gently pushed the door and tiptoed inside. As I peeped through the crack, I could see that he had indeed scored a success. A man was standing there with his back to him, and he was poring over the nudist magazine with greatest absorption. As he slowly turned the pages, his enthrallment showed in the way he frequently moved the pictures towards the light from the French window, inclining his head this way and that to take in all the angles. He looked as though he would have been happy to spend all day there, but when he heard Tristan's exquisitely timed cough, he dropped the magazine as though it was white-hot, snatched hurriedly at the Farmer's Weekly, and swung round. That was when Tristan's victory went flat. It was Mr. Mount. The huge farmer loomed over him for a few seconds, and the deep bass rumble came from between clenched teeth. "It's you, is it?" He glanced quickly from the young man to the embarrassing magazine and back again, and the eyes in the craggy face narrowed dangerously. "Yes, yes, yes, Mr. Mount," Tristan replied unsteadily. "And how are you, Mr. Mount?" "I'm all right." "Good, good, splendid." Tristan backed away a few steps. "And how is Deborah?" The eyes beneath the sprouting bristles drew in further. "She's all right." There was a silence which lingered interminably, and I felt for my young friend. It was not a merry meeting. At last he managed to work up a sickly smile. "Oh, well, yes, and what can we do for you, Mr. Mount?" "I've come to see me Oss." "Yes, indeed. Of course. Certainly. I believe Mr. Herriot is just outside the room." I led the big man down the long garden to the yard. His encounter with Tristan had clearly failed to improve his opinion of the young man, and he glowered as I opened the loose box. But his expression softened when he saw Bobby eating hay contentedly. He went in and patted the arching neck. "How's he going on, then?" "Oh, very well." I lifted a hind foot and showed him the metal plate. "I can take this off for you if you like." "Nay, nay, I don't want to disturb the job. As long as all's well, that's all I want to know." The dressings went on for a few more weeks, till finally Siegfried was satisfied that the last remnants of the disease had been extirpated. Then he telephoned for Mr. Mount to collect his horse the following morning. It is always nice to be in on a little triumph, and I looked over my boss's shoulder as he lifted Bobby's feet and displayed the finished job to the owner. The necrotic jumble on the soles had been replaced by a clean, smooth surface, with no sign of moisture anywhere. Mr. Mount was not enthusiastic by nature, but he was obviously impressed. He nodded his head rapidly several times. "Well now, that's champion." "I'm right cat with that." Siegfried lowered the foot to the ground and straightened with a pleased smile. There was a general air of bonhomie in the yard, and then I heard my car in the back lane. I felt a sudden tingle of apprehension. "Oh no, Tristan, not this time, please. You don't know." My toes curled as I waited, but I realized all was lost when the car turned in through the double doors. It had no driver. With a dreadful feeling of imminent catastrophe, I watched as it stopped within a few feet of Siegfried and Mr. Mount, who were staring at it in disbelief. Nothing happened for a few seconds. Then, without warning, Tristan catapulted like a jack-in-a-box into the open window. "Yippee!" he screeched. But his happy grin froze as he found himself gazing into the faces of his brother and Mr. Mount. Siegfried's expression of exasperation was familiar to me, but the farmer's was infinitely more menacing. The eyes and the stony visage were mere slits. The jaw jutted. The great tangle of eyebrows bristled fiercely. There was no doubt he had finally made up his mind about Tristan. I felt the young man had suffered enough, and I kept off the subject for a week or two afterwards. But we were sitting in the big room at Scaledale House when he mentioned casually that he wouldn't be taking Deborah out any more. "Seems her father has forbidden it," he said. I shrugged in sympathy, but said nothing. After all, it had been an ill-starred romance from the beginning. Chapter 31. Circuits and bumps, they called it. Taking off, circling the field, and landing, over and over again. After an hour of it with Fight Officer Woodham in full voice, I had had enough, and it was a blessed relief when we climbed out at the end. As my instructor walked away, one of his fellow officers strolled by his side. "How are you getting on with that chap, Woody?" he asked, smiling. Flight Officer Woodham did not pause in his stride or turn his head. "Oh, God," he said with a hollow groan. And that was all. I knew I wasn't meant to hear the words, but they bit deep. My spirits did not rise till I entered the barrack hut and was greeted by the cheerful voices of my fellow airmen. "Hello, Jim. How's it going, Jim?" The words were like balm. I looked around at the young men sprawled on their beds, reading or smoking, and I realized that I needed them, and their friendship. Animals are the same. They need friends. Have you ever watched two animals in a field? They may be a different species, a pony and a sheep, but they hang together. This comradeship between animals has always fascinated me, and I often think of Jack Sanders' two dogs as a perfect example of mutual devotion. One of them was called Jingo, and as I injected the local anaesthetic alongside the barbed wire tear in his skin, the powerful bull terrier whimpered just once. Then he decided to resign himself to his fate and looked stolidly to the front as I depressed the plunger. Meanwhile, his inseparable friend, Skipper the corgi, gnawed gently at Jingo's hind leg. It was odd to see two dogs on the table at once, but I knew the relationship between them and made no comment as their master hoisted them both up. After I had infiltrated the area around the wound, I began to stitch, and Jingo relaxed noticeably when he found that he could feel nothing. "Maybe this'll teach you to avoid barbed wire fences in future, Jing," I said. Jack Sanders laughed. "I doubt if it will, Mr. Herriot. I thought the coast was clear when I took him down the lane this morning, but he spotted a dog on the other side of the fence and he was through like a bullet. Fortunately, it was a greyhound and he couldn't catch it." "You're a regular terror, Jing." I patted my patient, and the big Roman-nosed face turned to me with an ear-to-ear grin, and at the other end the tail whipped delightedly. "Yes, it's amazing, isn't it?" his master said. "He's always looking for a fight, yet people and children can do anything with him. He's the best-natured dog in the world." I finished stitching and dropped the suture needle into the kidney dish on the trolley. "Well, you've got to remember that the bull terrier is the original English fighting dog, and Jing is only obeying an age-old instinct." "Oh, I realise that. I'll just have to go on scanning the horizon every time I take him off the lead. No dog is safe from him. Except this one, Jack." I laughed and pointed to the little corgi, who had tired of his companion's leg and was now chewing his ear. "Yes, isn't it marvellous? I think he could bite Jing's ear off without reprisal." It was indeed rather wonderful. The corgi was 11 years old and beginning to show his age in stiffness of movement and impairment of sight, while the bull terrier was only 3 at the height of his strength and power. A squat, barrel-chested bundle of bone and muscle, he was a formidable animal. But when the ear-chewing became too violent, all he did was turn and gently engulf Skipper's head in his huge jaws till the little animal desisted. Those jaws could be as merciless as a steel trap, but they held the tiny head in a loving embrace. 10 days later, their master brought both dogs back to the surgery for the removal of the stitches. He looked worried as he lifted the animals onto the table. "Jingo isn't at all well, Mr. Herriot," he said. "He's been off his food for a couple of days, and he looks miserable. Could that wound make him ill if it turns septic?" "Yes, it could, of course." I looked down anxiously at the area of the flank where I had stitched, and my fingers explored the long scar. "But there's not the slightest sign of infection here. No swelling, no pain. He's healed beautifully." I stepped back and looked at the bull terrier. He was strangely disconsolate, tail tucked down, eyes gazing ahead with total lack of interest. Not even the busy nibbling of his friend at one of his paws relieved his apathy. Clearly Skipper didn't like being ignored in this fashion. He transferred his operations to the front end and started on the big dog's ear. As his efforts still went unnoticed, he began to chew and tug harder, dragging the massive head down to one side. But as far as Jingo was concerned, he might as well not have been there. "Hey, that's enough, Skipper," I said. "Jing isn't in the mood for rough stuff today." I lifted him gently to the floor, where he paced indignantly around the table legs. I examined the bull terrier thoroughly, and the only significant finding was an elevated temperature. "It's 105, Jack. He's very ill, there's no doubt about that. But what's the matter with him?" "With a high fever like that, he must have some acute infection. But at the moment, it's difficult to pinpoint." I reached out and stroked the broad skull, running my fingers over the curving white face as my thoughts raced. For an instant, the tail twitched between his hocks and the friendly eyes rolled round to me and then to his master. It was that movement of the eyes which seized my whole attention. I quickly raised the upper lid. The conjunctiva appeared to be a normal pink, but in the smooth white sclera I could discern the faintest tinge of yellow. "He's got jaundice," I said. "Have you noticed anything peculiar about his urine?" Jack Sanders nodded. "Yes, now you mention it, I saw him cock his leg in the garden and his water looked a bit dark." Those are bile pigments. I gently squeezed the abdomen and the dog winced slightly. Yes, he's definitely tender in there. Jaundice? His master stared at me across the table. Where would he get that? I rubbed my chin. Well, when I see a dog like this, I think firstly of two things, phosphorus poisoning and leptospirosis. In view of the high temperature, I go for the leptospirosis. Would he catch it from another dog? Possibly, but more likely from rats. Does he come into contact with any rats? Well, yes, now and then. There's a lot of them in the old hen house at the foot of the lane, and Jing sometimes gets in there after them. Well, that's it. I shrugged. I don't think we need to look any further for the cause. He nodded slowly. Anyway, it's something to know what's wrong with him. Now you can set about putting him right. I looked at him for a moment in silence. It wasn't like that at all. I didn't want to upset him, but on the other hand, he was a highly intelligent and sensible man in his 40s, a teacher at the local school. I felt I had to tell him the whole truth. Jack, I said, this is a terrible condition to treat. If there's one thing I hate to see, it's a jaundiced dog. You mean it's serious? I'm afraid so. In fact, the mortality rate is very high. I felt for him when I saw the sudden pain and concern in his face, but a warning now was better than a shock later, because I knew that Jingo could be dead within a few days. Even now, 30 years later, I quail when I see that yellowish discoloration in a dog's eyes. Penicillin and other antibiotics have some effect against the causal organism of leptospirosis, but the disease is still very often fatal. I see. I see. He was collecting his thoughts. But surely you can do something. Oh, yes, of course, I said briskly. I'm going to give him a big shot of anti-leptospiral serum, and some medicine to administer by the mouth. It isn't completely hopeless. I injected the serum in the knowledge that it didn't have much effect at this stage, but I had nothing else to offer. I gave Skipper a shot too, with the happier feeling that it would protect him against the infection. One thing more, Jack, I added. This disease also affects humans, so please take all hygienic precautions when handling Jingo, all right? He nodded and lifted the bull terrier from the table. The big dog, as most of my patients do, tried to hurry away from the disturbing white coat and antiseptic atmosphere of the surgery. As he trotted along the passage, his master turned to me eagerly. Look at that. He doesn't seem too bad, does he? I didn't say anything. I hoped with all my heart that he was right, but I was fighting off the conviction that this nice animal was doomed. At any rate, I would soon know. I knew, in fact, next day. Jack Sanders was on the phone before 9 o'clock in the morning. Jing's not so good, he said, but the tremor in his voice belied the lightness of his words. Oh, I experienced the familiar drooping of the spirits. What is he doing? Nothing, I'm afraid. Won't eat a thing, lying around just lifeless. And every now and then he vomits. It was what I expected, but I still felt like kicking the desk by my side. Very well, I'll be right round. There were no tail wags from Jing today. He was crouched before the fire, gazing listlessly into the coals. The yellow in his eyes had deepened to a rich orange, and his temperature had soared. I repeated the serum injection, but the big dog did not heed the entry of the needle. Before I left, I ran my hand over the smooth, white body, and Skipper, as ever, kept burrowing in on his friend. But Jingo's thoughts were elsewhere, sunk in his inner misery. I visited him daily, and on the 4th day I found him stretched out almost comatose on his side. The conjunctiva, sclera, and the mucous membranes of the mouth were a dirty chocolate colour. Is he suffering? Jack Sanders asked. I hesitated for a moment. I honestly don't think he's in pain. Sickness, nausea, yes, but I'd say that's all. Well, I'd like to keep on trying, he said. I don't want to put him down, even though you think it's hopeless. You do, don't you? I made a non-committal gesture. I was watching Skipper, who seemed bewildered. He had given up his worrying tactics and was sniffing round his friend in a puzzled manner. Only once did he pull very gently at the unresponsive ear. I went through the motions with the feeling of helplessness and left with the unpleasant intuition that I would never see Jingo alive again. And even though I was waiting for it, Jack Sanders' phone call next morning was a bad start to the day. Jing died during the night, Mr. Herriot. I thought I'd better let you know. You said you were coming back this morning. He was trying to be matter-of-fact. "I'm sorry, Jack," I said. "I did rather expect—" "Yes, I know. And thank you for what you did." It made it worse when people were nice at these times. The Sanders were a childless couple and devoted to their animals. I knew how he was feeling. I stood there with the receiver in my hand. "Anyway, Jack, you've still got Skipper." It sounded a bit lame, but it did help to have the comfort of one remaining dog, even though he was old. "That's right," he replied. "We're very thankful for Skipper." I went on with my work. Patients died sometimes, and once it was over, it was almost a relief, especially when I knew in Jingo's case that the end was inevitable. But this thing wasn't over. Less than a week later, Jack Sanders was on the phone again. "It's Skipper," he said. "He seems to be going the same way as Jing." A cold hand took hold of my stomach and twisted it. But, he can't be. I gave him the protective injection." "Well, I don't know, but he's hanging around miserably and hardly eats a thing. He seems to be going down fast." I ran out and jumped into my car, and as I drove to the edge of the town where the Sanders lived, my heart thudded and panicky thoughts jostled around in my mind. How could he have got the infection? I had little faith in the serum as a cure, but as a prevention I felt it was safe. I had even given him a second shot to make sure. The idea of these people losing both their dogs was bad enough, but I couldn't bear the thought that the second one might be my fault. The little corgi trailed unhappily across the carpet when he saw me, and I lifted him quickly onto the kitchen table. I almost snatched at his eyelids in my anxiety, but there was no sign of jaundice in the sclera, nor in the mucous membranes of the mouth. The temperature was dead normal, and I felt a wave of relief. "He hasn't got leptospirosis anyway," I said. Mrs. Sanders clasped her hands. "Oh, thank God for that. We were sure it was the same thing. He looked so awful." I examined the little animal meticulously, and when I finished I put my stethoscope in my pocket. "Well, I can't find much wrong here. He's got a bit of a heart murmur, but you've known that for some time. He's old, after all." "Do you think he could be fretting for Jing?" Jack Sanders asked. "Yes, I do. They were such friends. He must feel lost." "But he'll get over that, won't he?" "Oh, of course he will. I'll leave some mild sedative tablets for him, and I'm sure they'll help." I met Jack a few days later in the marketplace. "How is Skipper?" I asked. He blew out his cheeks. "About the same. Maybe a bit worse. The trouble is, he eats practically nothing. He's getting very thin." I didn't see what else I could do, but on the following day I looked in at the Sanders as I was passing. I was shocked at the little corgi's appearance. Despite his age, he had been so cocky and full of bounce, and when Jing was alive he had been indisputably the boss dog. But now he was utterly deflated. He looked at me with lackluster eyes as I came in, then crept stiffly to his basket where he curled himself as though wishing to shut out the world. I examined him again. The heart murmur seemed a little more pronounced, but there was nothing else except that he looked old and decrepit and done. "You know, I'm beginning to wonder if he really is fretting," I said. "It could be just his age catching up on him. After all, he'll be 12 in the spring, won't he?" Mrs. Sanders nodded. "That's right. Then you think this could be the end?" "It's possible." I knew what she was thinking. A couple of weeks ago, 2 healthy dogs rolling around and playing in this house, and now there could soon be none. "But isn't there anything else you can do?" "Well, I can give him a course of digitalis for his heart, and perhaps you would bring in a sample of his urine. I want to see how his kidneys are functioning." I tested the urine. There was a little albumin, but no more than you would expect in a dog of his age. I ruled out nephritis as a cause. As the days passed, I tried other things. Vitamins, iron tonics, organophosphates, but the little animal declined steadily. It was about a month after Jing's death that I called to the house again. Skipper was in his basket, and when I called to him, he slowly raised his head. His face was pinched and fleshless, and the filled eyes regarded me without recognition. "Come on, lad," I said encouragingly. "Let's see you get out of there." Jack Sanders shook his head. "It's no good, Mr. Herriot. He never leaves his basket now, and when we lift him out, he's almost too weak to walk. Another thing. He makes a mess down here in the kitchen during the night. That's something he's never done. It was like the tolling of a sad bell. Everything he said pointed to a dog in the last stages of senility. I tried to pick my words. I'm sorry, Jack, but it all sounds as if the old chap has come to the end of the road. I don't think fretting could possibly cause all this. He didn't speak for a moment. He looked at his wife, then down at the forlorn little creature. Well, of course, this has been in the back of our minds, but we've kept hoping he would start to eat. What do you suggest? I could not bring myself to say the fateful words. It seems to me that we can't stand by and let him suffer. He's just a little skeleton, and I can't think he's getting any pleasure out of his life now. I see, he said. And I agree. He lies there all day. He has no interest in anything. He paused and looked at his wife again. I'll tell you what, Mr. Herriot. Let us think it over till tomorrow. But you do think there's no hope? Yes, Jack, I do. Old dogs often go this way at the end. Skipper has just cracked up. He's finished, I'm afraid. He drew a long breath. Right. If you don't hear from me by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, please come and put him to sleep. I had small hope of the call coming, and it didn't. In those early days of our marriage, Helen worked as a secretary for one of the local millers. We often started our day together by descending the long flights of stairs from our bed-sitter, and I would see her out of the front door before getting ready for my round. This morning she gave me her usual kiss before going out into the street, but then she looked at me searchingly. You've been quiet all through breakfast, Jim. What's the matter? Oh, it's nothing really. Just part of the job, I said. But when she kept her steady gaze on me, I told her quickly about the Sanders. She touched my arm. It's such a shame, Jim, but you can't let your sad cases depress you. You'd never survive. Oh, I know that. But I'm a softy, that's my trouble. Sometimes I think I should never have been a vet. You're wrong there, she said. I couldn't imagine you as anything else. You'll do what you have to do, and you'll do it the right way. She kissed me again, turned, and ran down the steps. It was mid-morning before I drew up outside the Sanders home. I opened the car boot and took out the syringe and the bottle of concentrated anaesthetic, which would give the old dog a peaceful and painless end. The first thing I saw when I went into the kitchen was a fat, white puppy waddling across the floor. I looked down in astonishment. What's this? Mrs. Sanders gave me a strained smile. Jack and I had a talk yesterday. We couldn't bear the thought of not having a dog at all, so we went round to Mrs. Palmer, who bred Jing, and found she had a litter for sale. Seemed like fate. We've called him Jingo, too. What a splendid idea. I lifted the pup, which squirmed in my hand, grunted in an obese manner, and tried to lick my face. This, I felt, would make my unpleasant task easier. I think you've been very sensible. I lifted the bottle of anaesthetic unobtrusively from my pocket and went over to the basket in the corner. Skipper was still curled in the unheeding ball of yesterday, and the comforting thought came to me that all I was going to do was push him a little further along the journey he had already begun. I pierced the rubber diaphragm on the bottle with my needle and was about to withdraw the barbiturate when I saw that Skipper had raised his head. Chin resting on the edge of the basket, he seemed to be watching the pup. Wearily, his eyes followed the tiny creature as it made its way to a dish of milk and began to lap busily. And there was something in his intent expression which had not been there for a long time. I stood very still as the corgi made a couple of attempts, then heaved himself to a standing position. He almost fell out of the basket and staggered on shaking legs across the floor. When he came alongside the pup, he remained there, swaying for some time, a gaunt caricature of his former self. But as I watched in disbelief, he reached forward and seized the little white ear in his mouth. Stoicism is not a characteristic of pups, and Jingo II yelped shrilly as the teeth squeezed. Skipper, undeterred, continued to gnaw with rapt concentration. I dropped bottle and syringe back in my pocket. "Bring him some food," I said quietly. Mrs. Sanders hurried to the pantry and came back with a few pieces of meat on a saucer. Skipper continued his ear nibbling for a few moments, then sniffed the puppy unhurriedly from end to end before turning to the saucer. He hardly had the strength to chew, but he lifted a portion of meat, and his jaws moved, slowly. "Good heavens!" Jack Sanders burst out. "That's the first thing he's eaten for days." His wife seized my arm. "What's happened, Mr. Herriot? We only got the puppy because we couldn't have a house without a dog." "Well, it looks to me as though you've got two again." I went over to the door and smiled back at the two people, watching fascinated as the corgi swallowed, then started determinedly on another piece of meat. "Good morning. I'm going now." About 8 months later, Jack Sanders came into the surgery and put Jingo 2 on the table. He was growing into a fine animal with the wide chest and powerful legs of the breed. His good-natured face and whipping tail reminded me strongly of his predecessor. "He's got a bit of eczema between his pads," Jack said. Then he bent and lifted Skipper up. At that moment, I had no eyes for my patient. All my attention was on the corgi, plump and bright-eyed, nibbling at the big dog's hind limbs with all his old bounce and vigour. "Just look at that," I murmured. "It's like turning the clock back." Jack Sanders laughed. "Yes, isn't it? They're tremendous friends, just like before. Come here, Skipper." I grabbed the little corgi and looked him over. When I had finished, I held him for a moment as he tried to wiggle his way back to his friend. "Do you know, I honestly think he'll go on for years yet." "Really?" Jack Sanders looked at me with a mischievous light in his eyes. "But I seem to remember you saying quite a long time ago that his days were over. He was finished." I held up a hand. I know. But sometimes it's lovely to be wrong." Chapter 32. "Today," said Fight Officer Woodham, "we're going to try a few new things. Spinning, side-slipping, and how to come out of a stall." His voice was gentle, and before he pulled on his helmet, he turned his dark, fine-featured face towards me and smiled. Walking over the grass, I thought what a likeable chap he was. I could have made a friend of him. But he was always like that on the ground. He was altogether different in the air. Yet I could never understand it. Flying was no trouble at all, and as we spun and dropped and soared about the summer sky, his instructions appeared simple and easy to carry out. But the rot, as always, began to set in very soon. "Didn't I tell you, opposite rudder and stick to side-slip?" he bawled over the intercom. "Yes, sir," was all I replied, instead of the more appropriate, "That's just what I'm doing, you stupid bugger," which I might have used in civil life. The goggled eyes bulged in the mirror. "Well, why the bloody hell aren't you doing it?" His voice rose to a wild shriek. "Sorry, sir." "Well, take her up. All try again. And for God's sake, keep your wits about you." It was the same with the spins and stalls. I hadn't the slightest difficulty in pulling out of them, but at times I thought my instructor was going out of his mind. Berserk cries rang in my ears. "Full opposite rudder and centralise the stick! Centralise it! Can't you hear me? Oh, God! God!" And of course the panic gradually crept in and I began to crack. One moment I could see the railway station in front of me whirling around in crazy circles, then there was nothing but the empty heavens, and within seconds fields and trees would start to rush at me. Everything kept changing bewilderingly except the enraged eyes in the mirror and the exasperated yells. "Centralise it, you bloody fool! Keep your eye on that cloud! Watch your artificial horizon! Don't you know what the altimeter's for? I told you to keep at 1,000 feet, but it's like talking to a bloody wall!" After a while, a kind of numbness took over, and the words rang meaninglessly in my head, one sentence seeming to contradict another. Desperately, I tried to sort out the volleys of advice, but the whole thing began to slip from my grasp. I had felt like this somewhere before. There was a familiar ring about this jumble in my brain. Then it came back to me. It was like being back at the bird whistles. The trouble with the bird whistles was that they all spoke at once. Mr. Birtwistle invariably discussed his livestock, his wife concentrated on family matters, and Len, their massive 18-year-old son, talked of nothing but football. I was examining Nellie, the big white cow that always stood opposite the doorway in the grey stone byre. She had been lame for over a week, and I didn't like the look of her. "Lift her foot, will you, Len?" I said. It was wonderful to have a muscular giant to hoist the hind limb instead of going through the tedious business of hauling it up with a rope over a beam. With the cloven hoof cradled in the great hands, I could see that my fears were realized. The space between the cleats was clear, but there was a significant swelling around the interphalangeal joint. I looked up from my stooping position. "Can you see that, Mr. Birtwistle? The infection is spreading upwards." "Aye, aye." The farmer thrust a finger against the tumefied area, and Nellie flinched. "It's going up her leg on that side, right enough. I thought it was nowt but a bit of foul, and I've been putting—" "By gar!" Len interjected. "The lads had a good win against Ellaby on Saturday. Johnny Nudd got another couple of goals in putting that caustic lotion between her cleats." Mr. Birtwistle didn't appear to have heard his son, but he was always like that. "Done it regular, night and morning, and I'll tell you the best way to do it. Get a hen feather, and I wouldn't be surprised if he scores a few more this Saturday," continued Len unheedingly. "It's a right Bobby Dazzler when you just dip it in lotion and push the feather in between cleats. It works like gets that ball on his right foot, he just whacks 'em in." I raised a hand. "Wait a minute. You must realize this cow hasn't got foul. She has suppurative arthritis in this little joint just at the coronet here. I don't want to use a lot of big words, but she has pus, matter, right inside the joint cavity, and it's a very nasty thing." Mr. Birtwistle nodded slowly. "Sort of an abscess, you mean? Well, maybe it'd be best to lance it. Once you let matter out, it would—" "Just like a rocket," went on Len. "I'll tell you, Johnny could get a trial for Darlington one of these days, and then—" I always think it is polite to look at a person when they are talking to you, but it is difficult when they are both talking at once, especially when one of them is bent double and the other standing behind you. "Thank you, Len," I said. "You can put her foot down now." I straightened up and directed my gaze somewhere between them. The trouble with this condition is that you can't just stick a knife into it and relieve it. Very often the smooth surfaces of the joint are eaten away, and it's terribly painful. Nellie would agree with me. It was the outside cleat which was affected, and she was standing with her legs splayed sideways in an attempt to take the weight on the healthy inner digit. The farmer asked the inevitable question. "Well, what are we going to do?" I had an uncomfortable conviction that it wasn't going to make much difference what we did, but I had to make an effort. "We'll give her a course of sulfanilamide powders, and I also want you to put a poultice on that foot 3 times daily." "Poultice?" The farmer brightened. "I've been doing that. If Darlington signed Johnny Nudd, I reckon—" "Hold on, Len," I said. "What poultice have you been using, Mr. Birtwistle?" "Cow shit," the farmer replied confidently. "You can't beat a good cow shit poultice to bring to bad out. I've used it for them bad cases. I'd have to go through to Darlington now and then instead of watching the kestrels," Len broke in. "I'd have to see how Johnny was getting on with them professionals because—" I managed a twisted smile. I liked football myself, and I found it touching that Len ignored the great panorama of league football to concentrate on a village team who played in front of about 20 spectators. Yes, Len, I quite understand how you feel." Then I turned to his father. "I was thinking of a rather different type of poultice, Mr. Birtwistle." The farmer's face lengthened, and the corners of his mouth drooped. "Well, I've never found out better than cow shit, and I've been among stock all my life." I clenched my teeth. This earthy medicament was highly regarded among the Dales farmers of the 30s, and the damnable thing was that it often achieved its objective. There was no doubt that a sackful of bovine feces applied to an inflamed area set up a tremendous heat and counter-irritation. In those days I had to go along with many of the ancient cures and keep my tongue between my teeth, but I never prescribed cow shit, and I wasn't going to start now. "Maybe so," I said firmly, "but what I was thinking of was kaolin. You could call down at the surgery for some. You just heat the tin in a pan of hot water and apply the poultice to the foot. It keeps its heat for several hours." Mr. Birtwistle showed no great enthusiasm, so I tried again. "Or you could use bran. I see you've got a sack over there." He cheered up a little. "Aye, that's right. OK. Put on some hot bran 3 times a day and give her the powders, and I'll see her again in a few days." I knew the farmer would do as I said, because he was a conscientious stockman. But I'd seen cases like this before, and I wasn't happy. Nothing seems to pull a good cow down quicker than a painful foot. Big fat animals could be reduced to skeletons within weeks because of the agony of septic arthritis. I could only hope. "Very good, Mr. Herriot," Mr. Birtwistle said. "And now come into the house. Missus has a cup of tea ready for you." I seldom refuse such an invitation, but as I entered the kitchen I knew this was where the going got really tough. "Now then, Mr. Herriot," the farmer's wife said, beaming as she handed me a steaming mug. "I was talking to your good lady in the marketplace yesterday, and she said—" "And you think them powders of yours might do the trick?" Her husband looked at me seriously. "Well, I hope so, because Nellie's a right good milker. I reckon last lactation she gave, Kestrels is drawn agin Dibbermint Ulton Cup." Len chimed in. "It'll be some game. Last time—" Mrs. Birtwistle continued without drawing breath. "You were nicely settled in at the top of Skeldale House. It must be right pleasant up there with a lovely view and— 5 gallons when she first calved, and she kept it up for— They nearly kicked us off pitch. But by God, I tell you, Will, you can see right over Darrowby. But it wouldn't do for a fat body like me. I was saying to your missus that you have to be young and slim to live up there. All them stairs and—" I took a long draught from my cup. It gave me a chance to focus my eyes and attention on just one thing as the conversation crackled unceasingly around me. I invariably found it wearing to try to listen to all 3 Birtwhistles in full cry, and, of course, it was impossible to look at them all simultaneously and adjust my expression to their different remarks. The thing that amazed me was that none of them ever became angry at the others butting in. Nobody ever said, "I'm speaking, do you mind?" or "Don't interrupt," or "For Pete's sake, shut up." They lived together in perfect harmony, with all of them talking at once, and none paying the slightest heed to what the other was saying. When I saw the cow during the following week, she was worse. Mr. Birtwistle had followed my instructions faithfully, but Nellie could scarcely hobble as he brought her in from the field. Len was there to lift the foot, and I gloomily surveyed the increased swelling. It ran right round the coronet from the heel to the interdigital cleft in front, and the slightest touch from my finger caused the big cow to jerk her leg in pain. I didn't say much because I knew what was in store for Nellie, and I knew, too, that Mr. Birtwistle wasn't going to like it when I told him. When I visited again at the end of the week, I had only to look at the farmer's face to realize that everything had turned out as I feared. For once, he was on his own, and he led me silently to the byre. Nellie was on 3 legs now, not daring even to bring the infected foot into momentary contact with the cobbled flooring. And worse, she was in an advanced state of emaciation. The sleek, healthy animal of 2 weeks ago reduced to little more than bone and hide. "I doubt she's had it," Mr. Birtwistle muttered. Cows' hind feet are difficult to lift, but today I didn't need any help because Nellie had stopped caring. I examined the swollen digit. It was now vast, a great ugly club of tissue with a trickle of pus discharging down the wall. "I see it's bust there." The farmer poked a finger at the ragged opening. "But it hasn't given her no relief." "Well, I wouldn't expect it to," I said. "Remember I told you the trouble is all inside the joint." "Well, these things happen," he replied. "I might as well telephone for Malik. She's hardly given a drop of milk, poor old lass. She's nowt but a screw now." I always had to wait for the threat of the knacker man's humane killer before I said what I had to say now. Right from the start, this had been a case for surgery, but it would have been a waste of time to suggest it at the beginning. Amputation of the bovine digit has always filled farmers with horror, and even now I knew I would have trouble convincing Mr. Birtwistle. "There's no need to slaughter her," I said. "There's another way of curing this." "Another way? We've tried hard enough, surely." I bent and lifted the foot again. "Look at this." I seized the inner cleat and moved it freely around. "This side is perfectly healthy. There's nothing wrong with it. It will bear Nellie's full weight." "Ah, but what about t'other horrible thing?" "I could remove it." "You mean cut it off?" "Yes." He shook his head vigorously. Nay, I'm not having that. She's suffered enough. Far better send for Jeff Mallock and get job over. Here he was again. Farmers are anything but shrinking violets, but there was something about this business which appalled them. "But Mr. Birtwistle," I said, "don't you see, the pain is immediately relieved. The pressure is off and all the weight rests on the good side." "I said no, Mr. Herriot, and I mean no. You've done your best and I thank you, but I'm not having her foot cut off and that's all about it." He turned and began to walk away. I looked after him helplessly. One thing I hate to do is talk a man into an operation on one of his beasts, for the simple reason that if anything goes wrong, I get the blame. But as I was just about certain that an hour's work could restore this good cow to her former state, I couldn't let it go at this. I trotted from the byre. The farmer was already halfway across the yard on his way to the phone. I panted up to him as he reached the farmhouse door. "Mr. Birtwistle, listen to me for a minute. I never said anything about cutting off her foot, just one cleat." "Well, that's half a foot, isn't it?" He looked down at his boots. "But it's how much for me?" "But she wouldn't know a thing," I pleaded. "She'd be under a general anaesthetic, and I'm nearly sure it would be a success." "Mr. Herriot, I just don't fancy it. I don't like the idea. And if it did work, it would be like having a crippled cow walking about." "Not at all. She would grow a little stump of horn there, and I'd like to bet you'd never notice a thing." He gave me a long, sideways look, and I could see he was weakening. "Look, Mr. Birtwistle," I said, pressing home the attack. "Within a month, Nellie could be a fat cow again, giving 5 gallons of milk a day." This was silly talk, not to be recommended to any veterinary surgeon, but I was seized by a kind of madness. I couldn't bear the thought of that cow being cut up for dog food when I was convinced I could put it right. And there was another thing. I was already savouring the pleasure, childish perhaps, of instantly relieving an animal's pain, of bringing off a spectacular cure. There aren't many operations in the field of bovine surgery where you can do this, but digit amputation is one of them. Something of my fervour must have been communicated to the farmer, because he looked at me steadily for a few moments, then shrugged. "When do you want to do it?" he asked. "Tomorrow." "Right. Will you need a lot of fellas to help?" "No, just you and Len. I'll see you at 10 o'clock. Next day the sun was warm on my back as I laid out my equipment on a small field near the house. It was a typical setting for many large animal operations I have carried out over the years. The sweet stretch of green, the grey stone buildings, and the peaceful bulk of the fells rising calm and unheeding into the white, scattering clouds. It took a long time for them to lead Nellie out, though she didn't have far to go, and as the bony scarecrow hopped painfully towards me, dangling her useless limb, the brave words of yesterday seemed foolhardy. "All right," I said, "stop there. That's a good spot." On the grass nearby lay my tray with the saw, chloroform, bandages, cotton wool, and iodoform. I had my long casting rope too, which we used to pull cattle down, but I had a feeling Nellie wouldn't need it. I was right. I buckled on the muzzle, poured some chloroform onto the sponge, and the big, white cow sank almost thankfully onto the cool, green herbage. "Kestrel's had a smashing match on Wednesday night," Len chuckled happily. "Johnny Nudd didn't score, but Len Bottomley—" "I hope we're doing right thing," muttered Mr. Birtwistle. "The way she staggered out here, I'd say it was a wasted time. Cracked in a couple of beauties." Len's face lit up at the memory. "Kestrel's is lucky to have 2 fellas like—" "Get hold of that bad foot, Len," I barked, playing them at their own game. "And keep it steady on that block of wood. And you, Mr. Birtwistle, hold her head down. I don't suppose she'll move, but if she does, we'll have to give her more chloroform." Cows are good subjects for chloroform anaesthesia, but I don't like to keep them out too long, in case of regurgitation of food. I was in a hurry. I quickly tied a bandage above the hoof, pulling it tight to serve as a tourniquet. Then I reached back to the tray for the saw. The books are full of sophisticated methods of digit amputation, with much talk of curved incisions, reflections of skin to expose the region of the articulations, and the like, but I have whipped off hundreds of cleats with a few brisk strokes of the saw below the coronary band with complete success. I took a long breath. "Hold tight, Len," and set to work. For a few moments there was silence except for the rhythmic grating of metal on bone. Then the offending digit was lying on the grass, leaving a flat stump from which a few capillary vessels spurted. Using curved scissors, I speedily disarticulated the remains of the bone from the second phalanx and held it up. "Look at that," I cried. "Almost eaten away." I pointed to the necrotic tissue in and around the joint. "And you see all that rubbish? No wonder she was in pain." I did a bit of quick curetting, dusted the surface with iodoform, applied a thick pad of cotton wool, and prepared to bandage. And as I tore the paper from the white rolls, I felt a stab of remorse. In my absorption, I had been rather rude. I had never replied to Len's remark about his beloved team. Maybe I could pass the next few minutes with a little gentle banter. "Hey, Len," I said, "when you're talking about the Kestrels, you never mention the time Willerton beat them 5-0. How is that?" In reply, the young man hurled himself unhesitatingly at me, butting me savagely on the forehead. The assault of the great coarse-haired head against my skin was like being attacked by a curly-polled bull, and the impact sent me flying backwards onto the grass. At first, the inside of my cranium was illuminated by a firework display, but as consciousness slipped away, my last sensation was of astonishment and disbelief. I loved football myself, but never had I thought that Len's devotion to the Kestrels would lead him to physical violence. He had always seemed a most gentle and harmless boy. I suppose I was out for only a few seconds, but I fancy I might have spent a good deal longer lying on the cool turf, but for the fact that something kept hammering out the message that I was in the middle of a surgical procedure. I blinked and sat up. Nellie was still sleeping peacefully against the green background of hills. Mr. Birtwistle, hands on her neck, was regarding me anxiously, and Len was lying unconscious, face down across the cow's body. "Has he hurt that, Mr. Herriot?" No, not really. What happened?" "I ought to have told you. He can't stand the sight of blood, great daft beggar." The farmer directed an exasperated glare at his slumbering son. "But I've never seen him go down as fast as that." "Pitched right into you, he did." I rolled the young man's inert form to one side and began again. I bandaged slowly and carefully because of the danger of post-operative hemorrhage. I finished with several layers of zinc oxide plaster, then turned to the farmer. "You can take her muzzle off now, Mr. Birtwistle. The job's done." I was starting to wash my instruments in the bucket when Len sat up almost as suddenly as he had slumped down. He was deathly pale, but he looked at me with his usual friendly smile. "What was it you were saying about the Kestrels, Mr. Herriot?" "Nothing, Len," I replied hastily. "Nothing at all." After 3 days, I returned and removed the original dressing, which was caked hard with blood and pus. I dusted the stump with powder again and bandaged on a clean, soft pad of cotton wool. "She'll feel a lot more comfortable now," I said. And indeed, Nellie was already looking vastly happier. She was taking some weight on the affected foot, rather gingerly, as though she couldn't believe that terrible thing had gone from her life. As she walked away, I crossed my fingers. The only thing that can ruin these operations is if the infection spreads to the other side. The inevitable result then is immediate slaughter and terrible disappointment. But it never happened to Nellie. When I took off the second dressing, she was almost sound, and I didn't see her again until about 5 weeks after the operation. I'd finished injecting one of Mr. Birtwistle's pigs when I asked casually, "And how's Nellie?" "Come and have a look at her," the farmer replied. "She's just in that field at side of road." We walked together over the grass to where the white cow was standing among her companions, head down, munching busily. And she must have done a lot of that since I saw her, because she was fat again. "Get on, lass." The farmer gently nudged her rump with his thumb, and she ambled forward a few paces before setting to work on another patch of grass. There wasn't the slightest trace of lameness. "Well, that's grand," I said. "And is she milking well, too?" "Aye, back to 5 gallons. He pulled a much-dented tobacco tin from his pocket, unscrewed the lid, and produced an ancient watch. "It's 10 o'clock, your man. Len'll have Garlin to house for his tea and allowance. Will you come in and have a cup?" I squared my shoulders and followed him inside, and the barrage began immediately. "Summat right funny happened on Saturday," Len said with a roar of laughter. "Walter Gimmett was refereeing and he gave penalties against Kestrels. So what did the lads do? Isn't it sad about old Mr. Brent?" Mrs. Birtwistle put her head on one side and looked at me piteously. "We buried him on Saturday, and—" "You know, Mr. Herriot," her husband put in, "I thought you were pulling my leg when you said Nellie would be giving 5 gallons again. I never—" "Dump the beggar in a horse trough," He won't give no more penalties against kestrels. You should have seen. It would have been his 90th birthday today, poor old man. He was well liked in village, and there was a big congregation. Parson said, "Expected out like that? I thought she might maybe put on a bit of flesh so we could get her off for beef. I'm right grateful to—" At that moment, fingers clenched tensely round my cap, I happened to catch sight of my reflection in a cracked mirror above the kitchen sink. It was a frightening experience, because I was staring glassily into space with my features contorted almost out of recognition. There was something of an idiot's smile as I acknowledged the humour of Walter in the horse trough, a touch of sorrow at Mr. Brent's demise, and I swear a suggestion of gratification at the successful outcome of Nellie's operation. And since I was also trying to look in 3 directions at once, I had to give myself full marks for effort. But, as I say, I found it a little unnerving, and excused myself soon afterwards. The men were still busy with Mrs. Birtwhistle's apple pie and scones, and the conversation was raging unabated when I left. The closure of the door behind me brought a sudden peace. The feeling of tranquillity stayed with me as I got into my car and drove out of the yard and onto the narrow country road. It persisted as I stopped the car after less than 100 yards and wound down the window to have a look at my patient. Nellie was lying down now. She had eaten her fill and was resting comfortably on her chest as she chewed her cud. To a doctor of farm animals, there is nothing more reassuring than that slow, lateral grinding. It means contentment and health. She gazed at me across the stone wall, and the placid eyes in the white face added to the restfulness of the scene, accentuating the silence after the babel of voices in the farmhouse. Nellie couldn't talk, but those calmly moving jaws told all I wanted to know. Chapter 33. To me, there are few things more appealing than a dog begging. This one was tied to a lamppost outside a shop in Windsor. Its eyes were fixed steadfastly on the shop doorway, willing its owner to come out, and every now and then it sat up in mute entreaty. Flying had been suspended for an afternoon. It gave us all a chance to relax, and no doubt it eased the frayed nerves of our instructors. But as I looked at that dog, all the pressures of the RAF fell away, and I went back to Derby. It was when Siegfried and I were making one of our market day sorties that we noticed the little dog among the stalls. When things were quiet in the surgery, we often used to walk together across the cobbles and have a word with the farmers gathered around the doorway of the Drovers' Arms. Sometimes we collected a few outstanding bills or drummed up a bit of work for the forthcoming week. And if nothing like that happened, we still enjoyed the fresh air. The thing that made us notice the dog was that he was sitting up begging in front of the biscuit stall. "Look at that little chap," Siegfried said. "I wonder where he's sprung from." As he spoke, the stallholder threw a biscuit, which the dog devoured eagerly, but when the man came round and stretched out a hand, the little animal trotted away. He stopped, however, at another stall which sold produce, eggs, cheese, butter, cakes, and scones. Without hesitation, he sat up again in the begging position, rock steady, paws dangling, head pointing expectantly. I nudged Siegfried. "There he goes again." My colleague nodded. "Yes. He's an engaging little thing, isn't he? What breed would you call him?" "A cross, I'd say. He's like a little brown sheepdog, but there's a touch of something else, maybe terrier." It wasn't long before he was munching a bun, and this time we walked over to him. And as we drew near, I spoke gently. "Here, boy," I said, squatting down a yard away. "Come on, let's have a look at you." He faced me, and for a moment 2 friendly brown eyes gazed at me from a singularly attractive little face. The fringed tail waved in response to my words, but as I inched nearer, he turned and ambled unhurriedly among the market-day crowd till he was lost to sight. I didn't want to make a thing out of the encounter, because I could never quite divine Siegfried's attitude to the small animals. He was eminently wrapped up in his horsework and often seemed amused at the way I'd rushed around after dogs and cats. At that time, in fact, Siegfried was strongly opposed to the whole idea of keeping animals as pets. He was quite vociferous on the subject, said it was utterly foolish, despite the fact that 5 assorted dogs travelled everywhere with him in his car. Now, 35 years later, he is just as strongly in favour of keeping pets, though he now carries only 1 dog in his car. So, as I say, it was difficult to assess his reactions in this field, and I refrained from following the little animal. I was standing there when a young policeman came up to me. "I've been watching that little dog begging among the stalls all morning," he said. "But like you, I haven't been able to get near him." "Yes, it's strange. He's obviously friendly, yet he's afraid. I wonder who owns him." "I reckon he's a stray, Mr. Herriot. I'm interested in dogs myself, and I fancy I know just about all of them round here. But this one's a stranger to me." I nodded. "I bet you're right. So anything could have happened to him. He could have been ill-treated by somebody and run away, or he could have been dumped from a car." "Yes," he replied. "There's some lovely people around. It beats me how anybody can leave a helpless animal to fend for itself like that. I've had a few goes at catching him myself, but it's no good." The memory stayed with me for the rest of the day, and even when I lay in bed that night, I was unable to dispel the disturbing image of the little brown creature wandering in a strange world, sitting up, asking for help in the only way he knew. I was still a bachelor at that time, and on the Friday night of the same week, Siegfried and I were arraying ourselves in evening dress in preparation for the hunt ball at East Hurdsley, about 10 miles away. It was a tortuous business, because those were the days of starched shirt fronts and stiff high collars, and I kept hearing explosions of colourful language from Siegfried's room as he wrestled with his studs. I was in an even worse plight, because I had outgrown my suit, and even when I had managed to secure the strangling collar, I had to fight my way into the dinner jacket, which nipped me cruelly under the arms. I had just managed to don the complete outfit and was trying out a few careful breaths when the phone rang. It was the same young policeman I had been speaking to earlier in the week. "We've got that dog round here, Mr. Herriot. You know, the one that was begging in the marketplace." "Oh, yes. Somebody's managed to catch him, then?" There was a pause. "No, not really. One of our men found him lying by the roadside about a mile out of town and he brought him in. He's been in an accident." I told Siegfried. He looked at his watch. "Always happens, doesn't it, James? Just when we're ready to go out. It's 9 o'clock now, and we should be on our way." He thought for a moment. "Anyway, slip round there and have a look, and I'll wait for you. It would be better if we could go to this affair together." As I drove round to the police station, I hoped fervently that there wouldn't be much to do. This hunt ball meant a lot to my boss, because it would be a gathering of the horse-loving fraternity of the district, and he would have a wonderful time just chatting and drinking with so many kindred spirits, even though he hardly danced at all. Also, he maintained it was good for business to meet the clients socially. The kennels were at the bottom of a yard behind the station, and the policeman led me down and opened one of the doors. The little dog was lying very still under the single electric bulb, and when I bent and stroked the brown coat, his tail stirred briefly among the straw of his bed. "He can still manage a wag, anyway," I said. The policeman nodded. "Aye, there's no doubt he's a good-natured little thing." I tried to examine him as much as possible without touching. I didn't want to hurt him, and there was no saying what the extent of his injuries might be. But even at a glance, certain things were obvious. He had multiple lacerations, one hind leg was crooked in the unmistakable posture of a fracture, and there was blood on his lips. This could be from damaged teeth, and I gently raised the head with a view to looking into his mouth. He was lying on his right side, and as the head came round, it was as though somebody had struck me in the face. The right eye had been violently dislodged from its socket, and it sprouted like some hideous growth from above the cheekbone, a great glistening orb with the eyelids tucked behind the white expanse of sclera. I seemed to squat there for a long time, stunned by the obscenity, and as the seconds dragged by, I looked into the little dog's face, and he looked back at me, trustingly from one soft brown eye, glaring meaninglessly from the grotesque ball on the other side. The policeman's voice broke my thoughts. "He's a mess, isn't he?" Yes. Yes. Must have been struck by some vehicle. Maybe dragged along by the look of all those wounds. "What do you think, Mr. Herriot?" I knew what he meant. It was the sensible thing to ease this lost, unwanted creature from the world. He was grievously hurt, and he didn't seem to belong to anybody. A quick overdose of anesthetic. His troubles would be over, and I'd be on my way to the dance. But the policeman didn't say anything of the sort. Maybe, like me, he was looking into the soft depths of that one trusting eye. I stood up quickly. "Can I use your phone?" At the other end of the line, Siegfried's voice crackled with impatience. "Hell, James, it's 9:30. If we're going to this thing, we've got to go now. We might as well not bother. A stray dog, badly injured, it doesn't sound such a great problem." "I know, Siegfried. I'm sorry to hold you up, but I can't make up my mind. I wish you'd come round and tell me what you think." There was a silence, then a long sigh. "All right, James. See you in 5 minutes." He created a slight stir as he entered the station. Even in his casual working clothes, Siegfried always managed to look distinguished. But as he swept into the station newly bathed and shaved, a camel coat thrown over the sparkling white shirt and black tie, there was something ducal about him. He drew respectful glances from the men sitting around. Then my young policeman stepped forward. "This way, sir," he said, and we went back to the kennels. Siegfried was silent as he crouched over the dog, looking him over as I had done without touching him. Then he carefully raised the head and the monstrous eye glared. "My God," he said softly, and at the sound of his voice the long fringed tail moved along the ground. For a few seconds he stayed very still, looking fixedly at the dog's face, while in the silence the whisking tail rustled the straw. Then he straightened up. "Let's get him round there," he murmured. In the surgery, we anaesthetized the little animal, and as he lay unconscious on the table, we were able to examine him thoroughly. After a few minutes, Siegfried stuffed his stethoscope into the pocket of his white coat and leant both hands on the table. "Luxated eyeball, fractured femur, umpteen deep lacerations, broken claws. There's enough here to keep us going till midnight, James." I didn't say anything. My boss pulled the knot from his black tie and undid the front stud. He peeled off the stiff collar and hung it on the crossbar of the surgery lamp. "By God, that's better," he muttered, and began to lay out suture materials. I looked at him across the table. "How about the hunt ball?" "Oh, bugger the hunt ball," Siegfried said. "Let's get busy." We were busy too, for a long time. I hung up my collar next to my colleagues, and we began on the eye. I know we both felt the same. We wanted to get rid of that horror before we did anything else. I lubricated the great ball and pulled the eyelids apart while Siegfried gently maneuvered it back into the orbital cavity. I sighed as everything slid out of sight, leaving only the cornea visible. Siegfried chuckled with satisfaction. "Looks like an eye again, doesn't it?" He seized the ophthalmoscope and peered into the depths. "And there's no major damage. Could be as good as new again, but we'll just stitch the lids together to protect it for a few days." The broken ends of the fractured tibia were badly displaced, and we had to struggle to bring them into apposition before applying the plaster of Paris. But at last we finished, and started on the long job of stitching the many cuts and lacerations. We worked separately for this, and for a long time it was quiet in the operating room except for the snip of scissors as we clipped the brown hair away from the wounds. I knew, and Siegfried knew, that we were almost certainly working without payment, but the most disturbing thought was that after all our efforts we might still have to put him down. He was still in the care of the police, and if nobody claimed him within 10 days it meant euthanasia. And if his late owners were really interested in his fate, why hadn't they tried to contact the police before now? By the time we had completed our work and washed the instruments, it was after midnight. Siegfried dropped the last suture needle into its tray and looked at the sleeping animal. "I think he's beginning to come around," he said. "Let's take him through to the fire, and we can have a drink while he recovers." We stretchered the dog through to the sitting room on a blanket and laid him on the rug before the brightly burning coals. My colleague reached a long arm up to the glass-fronted cabinet above the mantelpiece and pulled down the whiskey bottle and 2 glasses. Drinks in hand, collarless, still in shirt-sleeves, with our starched white fronts and braided evening trousers to remind us of the lost dance, we lay back in our chairs on either side of the fireplace, and between us our patient stretched peacefully. He was a happier sight now. One eye was closed by the protecting stitches, and his hind leg projected stiffly in its white cast. But he was tidy, cleaned up, cared for. He looked as though he belonged to somebody. But then there was a great big doubt about that. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, and we were getting well down the bottle when the shaggy brown head began to move. Siegfried leant forward and touched one of the ears, and immediately the tail flapped against the rug, and a pink tongue lazily licked his fingers. "What an absolutely grand little dog," he murmured. But his voice had a distant quality. I knew he was worried too. I took the stitches out of the eyelids 2 days after, and was delighted to find a normal eye underneath. The young policeman was as pleased as I was. "Look at that," he exclaimed. You'd never know anything had happened there. Yes, it's done wonderfully well. All the swelling and inflammation has gone. I hesitated for a moment. Has anybody inquired about him? He shook his head. Nothing yet. But there's another 8 days to go, and we're taking good care of him here. I visited the police station several times, and the little animal greeted me with undisguised joy, all his fear gone, standing upright against my legs on his plastered limb, his tail swishing. But all the time my sense of foreboding increased, and on the 10th day I made my way, almost with dread, to the police kennels. I had heard nothing. My course of action seemed inevitable. Putting down old or hopelessly ill dogs was often an act of mercy, but when it was a young, healthy dog, it was terrible. I hated it, but it was one of those things veterinary surgeons had to do. The young policeman was standing in the doorway. "Still no news?" I asked, and he shook his head. I went past him into the kennel, and the shaggy little creature stood up against my legs as before, laughing into my face, mouth open, eyes shining. I turned away quickly. I'd have to do this right now, or I'd never do it. "Mr. Herriot?" The policeman put his hand on my arm. "I think I'll take him." "You?" I stared at him. "Aye, that's right. We've got a lot of stray dogs in here, and though I feel sorry for them, you can't give them all a home, can you?" "No, you can't," I said. "I have the same problem." He nodded slowly. "But somehow this one's different, and it seems to me he's just come at the right time. I have 2 little girls, and they've been at me for a bit to get him a dog. This little bloke looks just right for the job." Warm relief began to ebb through me. I couldn't agree more. He's the soul of good nature. I bet he'll be wonderful with children. Good. That's settled then. I thought I'd ask your advice first. He smiled happily. I looked at him as though I'd never seen him before. "What's your name?" "Phelps," he replied. "P.C. Phelps." He was a good-looking young fellow, clear-skinned, with cheerful blue eyes and a solid, dependable look about him. I had to fight against an impulse to wring his hand and thump him on the back, but I managed to preserve the professional exterior. "Well, that's fine." I bent and stroked the little dog. "Don't forget to bring him along to the surgery in 10 days for removal of the stitches, and we'll have to get that plaster off in about a month." It was Siegfried who took out the stitches, and I didn't see our patient again until 4 weeks later. P.C. Phelps had his little girls, aged 4 and 6, with him, as well as the dog. "You said the plaster ought to come off about now," he said, and I nodded. He looked down at the children. "Well, come on, you two, lift him on the table." Eagerly, the little girls put their arms around their new pet, and as they hoisted him, the tail wagged furiously and the wide mouth panted in delight. "Looks as though he's been a success," I said. He smiled. "That's an understatement. He's perfect with these two. I can't tell you what pleasure he's given us. He's one of the family." I got out my little saw and began to hack at the plaster. "It's worked both ways, I should say. A dog loves a secure home." "Well, he couldn't be more secure." He ran his hand along the brown coat and laughed as he addressed the little dog. "That's what you get for begging among the stores on market day, my lad. You're in the hands of the law now." Chapter 34. When I entered the RAF, I had a secret fear. All my life I have suffered from vertigo, and even now I have only to look down from the smallest height to be engulfed by that dreadful dizziness and panic. What would I feel then, when I started to fly? As it turned out, I felt nothing. I could gaze downwards from the open cockpit through thousands of feet of space without a qualm, so my fear was groundless. I had my fears in veterinary practice too. And in the early days, the thing which raised the greatest terror in my breast was the Ministry of Agriculture. An extraordinary statement, perhaps, but true. It was the clerical side that scared me, all those forms. As to the practical ministry work itself, I felt in all modesty that I was quite good at it. My thoughts often turned back to all the tuberculin testing I used to do, clipping a clean little area from just the right place in the cow's neck, inserting the needle into the thickness of the skin and injecting 1/10 of a cc of tuberculin. It was on Mr. Hill's farm, and I watched the satisfactory intradermal pea rise up under my needle. That was the way it should be. And when it came up like that, you knew you were really doing your job, and testing the animal for tuberculosis. "That one's number 65, the farmer said, Then a slightly injured look spread over his face as I checked the number in the ear. "You're wasting your time, Mr. Herriot. I have the whole list all in correct order. Wrote it out special for you so you could take it away with you." I had my doubts. All farmers were convinced that their herd records were flawless, but I had been caught out before. I seemed to have the gift of making every possible clerical mistake, and I didn't need any help from the farmers. But still, it was tempting. I looked at the long list of figures dangling from the horny fingers. If I accepted it, I would save a lot of time. There were still more than 50 animals to test here, and I had to get through 2 more herds before lunchtime. I looked at my watch. Damn, I was well behind my program, and I felt the old stab of frustration. "Right, Mr. Hill, I'll take it, and thank you very much." I stuffed the sheet of paper into my pocket and began to move along the byre, clipping and injecting at top speed. A week later, the dread words leapt out at me from the open-day book. Ring Min. The cryptic phrase in Miss Harbottle's writing had the power to freeze my blood quicker than anything else. It meant simply that I had to telephone the Ministry of Agriculture office. And whenever our secretary wrote those words in the book, it meant that I was in trouble again. I extended a trembling hand towards the receiver. As always, Kitty Pattison answered my call, and I could detect the note of pity in her voice. She was the attractive girl in charge of the office staff, and she knew all about my misdemeanours. In fact, when it was something very trivial, she sometimes brought it to my attention herself, but when I had really dropped a large brick, I was dealt with by the boss, Charles Harcourt, the divisional inspector. "Ah, Mr. Herriot," Kitty said lightly. I knew she sympathised with me, but she couldn't do a thing about it. "Mr. Harcourt wants a word with you." There it was, the terrible sentence that always set my heart thumping. "Thank you," I said huskily, and waited an eternity as the phone was switched through. "Herriot!" The booming voice made me jump. I swallowed. "Morning, Mr. Harcourt. How are you?" "I'll tell you how I am. I'm bloody annoyed." I could imagine vividly the handsome, high-coloured, choleric face flushing deeper, the greenish eyes glaring. "In fact, I'm hopping bloody mad." "Oh." "It's no use saying oh. That's what you said the last time when you tested that cow of Franklin's that had been dead for 2 years. That was very clever. I don't know how you managed it. Now, I've been going over your test at Hills of High View, and there are 2 cows here that you've tested, numbers 74 and 103. Now, our records show that he sold both of them at Broughton Auction Mart 6 months ago. So you performed another miracle." "I'm sorry." "Please don't be sorry. It's bloody marvellous how you do it. I have all the figures here. Skin measurements, the lot. I see you found they were both thin-skinned animals, even though they were about 15 miles away at the time. Clever stuff. Well, all right, Herriot, I'll dispense with the comedy. I'm going to tell you once more, for the last time, and I hope you're listening." He paused, and I could almost see the big shoulders bunching as he barked into the telephone. "Look in the bloody ears in future." I broke into a rapid gabble. "I will indeed, Mr. Harcourt. I assure you that from now on—" All right, but there's something else." "Something else?" "Yes, I'm not finished yet." The voice took on a great weariness. "Can I ask you to cast your mind back to that cow you took under the TB order from Wilson of Low Parks?" I dug my nails into my palm. We were heading for deep waters. "Yes, I remember it." "Well now, Herriot, lad, do you remember a little chat we had about the forms?" Charles was trying to be patient, because he was a decent man, but it was costing him dearly. "Didn't anything I told you sink in?" "Well, yes, of course." "Then why didn't you send me a receipt for slaughter?" "Receipt for—" "Didn't I?" "No, you didn't," he said, "and honestly I can't understand it. I went over it with you step by step last time when you forgot to forward a copy of the valuation agreement." "Oh, dear. I really am sorry." A deep sigh came from the other end. "And there's nothing to it." He paused. "Tell you what we'll do. Let's go over the procedure once more, shall we?" "Yes, by all means." "Very well," he said. "First of all, When you find an infected animal, you serve B205DT Form A, which is the notice requiring detention and isolation of the animal. Next, and I could hear the slap of finger on palm as he enumerated his points. Next, there is B207DT Form C, notice of intended slaughter. Then B208DT Form D, post-mortem certificate. Then B196DT, veterinary inspector's report. Then B209DT, valuation agreement, and in cases where the owner objects, there is B213DT, appointment of valuer. Then we have a B212DT, notice to owner of time and place of slaughter, followed by B227DT, receipt for animal for slaughter, and finally B230DT, notice requiring cleansing and disinfection. Damn it, a child could understand that. It's perfectly simple, isn't it? Yes. Yes, certainly. Absolutely. It wasn't simple to me, but I didn't mention the fact. He had calmed down nicely, and I didn't want to inflame him again. Well, thank you, Mr. Harcourt. I said, I'll see it doesn't happen again. I put down the receiver with the feeling that things could have turned out a lot worse. But for all that, my nerves didn't stop jangling for some time. The trouble was that the ministry work was desperately important to general practitioners. In fact, in those precarious days, it was the main rent-payer. This business of the tuberculosis order. When a veterinary surgeon came upon a cow with open TB, it was his duty to see that the animal was slaughtered immediately because its milk could be a danger to the public. Well, that sounds easy. But unfortunately, the law insisted that the demise of each unhappy creature be commemorated by a confetti-like shower of the doom-laden forms. It wasn't just that there were so many of these forms, but they had to be sent to an amazing variety of people. Sometimes I used to think that there were very few people in England who didn't get one. Apart from Charles Harcourt, other recipients included the farmer concerned, the police, the head office of the ministry, the knacker man, the local authority. I nearly always managed to forget one of them. I used to have nightmares about standing in the middle of the marketplace, throwing the forms around me at the passers-by and laughing hysterically. Looking back, I can hardly believe that for all this wear and tear on the nervous system, the payment was 1 guinea, plus 10 and sixpence for the post-mortem. It was a mere 2 days after my interview with the divisional inspector that I had to take another cow under the TB order. When I came to fill in the forms, I sat at the surgery desk in a dither of apprehension, going over them again and again, laying them out side by side and enclosing them one by one in their various envelopes. This time there must be no mistake. I took them over to the post myself and uttered a silent prayer as I dropped them into the box. Charles would have them the following morning, and I would soon know if I had done it again. When 2 days passed without incident, I felt I was safe. But midway through the third morning, I dropped in at the surgery and read the message in letters of fire. Ring Min. Kitty Patterson sounded strained. She didn't even try to appear casual. "Oh, yes, Mr. Herriot," she said hurriedly. "Mr. Harcourt asked me to call you. I'm putting you through now." My heart almost stopped as I waited for the familiar bellow. But when the quiet voice came on the line, it frightened me even more. "Good morning, Herriot." Charles was curt and impersonal. "I'd like to discuss that last cow you took under the order." "Oh, yes," I croaked. "But not over the telephone. I want to see you here in the office." "In the office?" "Yes. Right away, if you can." I put down the phone and went out to the car with my knees knocking. Charles Harcourt was really upset this time. There was a kind of restrained fury in his words, and this business of going to the office, that was reserved for serious transgressions. 20 minutes later, my footsteps echoed in the corridors of the ministry building. Marching stiffly like a condemned man, I passed the windows where I could see the typists at work. Then I read, "Divisional Inspector" on the door at the end. I took one long, shuddering breath, then knocked. "Come in." The voice was still quiet and controlled. Charles looked up unsmilingly from his desk as I entered. He motioned me to a chair and directed a cold stare at me. "Herriot," he said unemotionally, "you're really on the carpet this time." Charles had been a major in the Punjabi Rifles, and he was very much the Indian Army officer at this moment. A fine-looking man, clear-skinned and ruddy, with massive cheekbones above a powerful jaw. Looking at the dangerously glinting eyes, it struck me that only a fool would trifle with somebody like him, and I had a nasty feeling that I had been trifling. Dry-mouthed, I waited. "You know, Herriot," he went on, "after our last telephone conversation about TB forms, I thought you might give me a little peace." "Peace? Yes, it was silly of me, I know, but when I took all that time to go over the procedure with you, I actually thought you were listening." I was. "You were? Oh, good." He gave me a mirthless smile. "Then I suppose it was even more foolish of me to expect you to act upon my instructions. In my innocence, I thought you cared about what I was telling you." "Mr. Harcourt, believe me, I do care. Then why?" he bawled without warning, bringing his great hand flailing down on the desk with a crash that made pens and inkwells dance. "Why the bloody hell do you keep making a balls of it?" I resisted a strong impulse to run away. I don't quite understand." "You don't?" He kept up his pounding on the desk. "Well, I'll tell you. One of my veterinary officers was on that farm and he found that you hadn't served a notice of cleansing and disinfection." "Is that so?" "Yes, it bloody well is so. You didn't give one to the farmer, but you sent one to me. Maybe you want me to go and disinfect the place, is that it? Would you like me to slip along there and get busy with a hosepipe? I'll go now if it'll make you feel any happier." "Oh, no. He was apparently not satisfied with the thunderous noise he was making, because he began to use both hands, bringing them down simultaneously with sickening force on the wood while he glared wildly. "Herriot!" he shouted. "There is just one thing I want to know from you. Do you want this bloody work, or don't you? Just say the word, and I'll give it to another practice, and then maybe we'll both be able to have a quiet life." "Please, Mr. Harcourt, I give you my word. We do want the work very much." And I meant it with all my heart. The big man slumped back in his chair and regarded me for a few moments in silence. Then he glanced at his wristwatch. 12:10, he murmured. "Just time to have a beer at the Red Lion before lunch." In the pub lounge, he took a long pull at his glass, placed it carefully on the table in front of him, then turned to me with a touch of weariness. "You know, Herriot, I do wish you'd stop doing this sort of thing. It takes it out of me." I believed him. His face had lost a little of its colour, and his hand trembled slightly as he raised his glass again. "I'm truly sorry, Mr. Harcourt. I don't know how it happened. I did try to get it right this time, and I'll do my best to avoid troubling you in future." He nodded a few times, then clapped me on the shoulder. "Good. Good! Let's just have one more." He moved over to the bar, brought back the drinks, then fished out a brown paper parcel from his pocket. "Little wedding present, Herriot. Understand you're getting married soon. This is from my missus and me, with our best wishes." I didn't know what to say. I fumbled the wrapping away and uncovered a small, square barometer. Shame engulfed me as I muttered a few words of thanks. This man was the head of the ministry in the area, while I was the newest and lowest of his minions. Not only that, but I was pretty sure I caused him more trouble than all the others put together. I was like a hair shirt to him. There was no earthly reason why he should give me a barometer. This last experience deepened my dread of form-filling to the extent that I hoped it would be a long time before I encountered another tuberculous animal, but fate decreed that I had some concentrated days of clinical inspections, and it was with a feeling of inevitability that I surveyed Mr. Moverley's Ayrshire cow. It was the soft cough which made me stop and look at her more closely. and as I studied her, my spirits sank. This was another one. The skin stretched tightly over the bony frame, the slightly accelerated respirations, and that deep, careful cough. Mercifully, you don't see cows like that now, but in those days they were all too common. I moved along her sides and examined the wall in front of her. The telltale blobs of sputum were clearly visible on the rough stones, and I quickly lifted a sample and smeared it on a glass slide. Back at the surgery, I stained the smear by Zeal-Nielsen's method and pushed the slide under the microscope. The red clumps of tubercle bacilli lay among the scattered cells, tiny, iridescent, and deadly. I hadn't really needed the grim proof, but it was there. Mr. Moverley was not amused when I told him next morning the animal would have to be slaughtered. "It's nobbut got a bit of a chill," he grunted. The farmers were never pleased when one of their milk producers was removed by a petty bureaucrat like me, but I suppose it's no use arguing. I assure you, Mr. Moverley, there's no doubt about it. I examined that sample last night and— oh, never mind about that. The farmer waved an impatient hand. "If bloody government says my cow's got to go, she's got to go, but I get compensation, don't I?" "Yes, you do." "How much?" I thought rapidly. The rules stated that the animal be valued as if it were up for sale in the open market in its present condition. The minimum was £5, and there was no doubt that this emaciated cow came into that category. "The statutory value is £5, I said. "Shit," replied Mr. Moverley. "We can appoint a valuer if you don't agree." "Oh, hell, let's get job over with." He was clearly disgusted, and I thought it imprudent to tell him that he would only get a proportion of the £5, depending on the post-mortem. "Very well," I said. "I'll tell Jeff Mallet to collect her as soon as possible." The fact that I was unpopular with Mr. Moverley didn't worry me as much as the prospect of dealing with the dreaded forms. The very thought of sending another batch winging hopefully on its way to Charles Harcourt brought me out in a sweat. Then I had a flash of inspiration. Such things don't often happen to me, but this struck me as brilliant. I wouldn't send off the forms till I'd had them vetted by Kitty Pattison. I couldn't wait to get the plan under way. Almost gleefully, I laid the papers out in a long row, signed them, and laid them by their envelopes ready for their varied journeys. Then I phoned the ministry office. Kitty was patient and kind. I'm sure she realised that I did my work conscientiously, but that I was a clerical numbskull, and she sympathised. When I'd finished going through the list, she congratulated me. "Well done, Mr. Herriot, you've got them right this time. All you need now is the knacker man's signature and your post-mortem report, and you're home and dry." "Bless you, Kitty," I said. "You've made my day." And she had. The airy sensation of relief was tremendous. The knowledge that there would be no comeback from Charles this time was like the sun bursting through dark clouds. I felt like singing as I went round to Mallet's yard and arranged with him to pick up the cow. "Have her ready for me to inspect tomorrow, Jeff," I said, and went on my way with a light heart. I couldn't understand it when Mr. Moverley waved me down from his farm gate next day. As I drew up, I could see he was extremely agitated. "Hey!" he cried. "I've just got back from the market and my missus tells me Mallet's been." I smiled. "That's right, Mr. Moverley. Remember I told you I was going to send him around for your cow?" "Aye, I know all about that." He paused and glared at me. "But he's took the wrong one." "Wrong what?" "Wrong cow, that's what. He's off with the best cow in me herd, pedigree Ayrshire. I bought her in Dumfries last week and they only delivered her this morning." Horror drove through me in a freezing wave. I had told the knacker man to collect the Ayrshire, which would be isolated in the loose box in the yard. The new animal would be in a box too, after her arrival. I could see Jeff and his man leading her up the ramp into his wagon with a dreadful clarity. "This is your responsibility, thou knows." The farmer waved a threatening finger. "If he kills me good cow, you'll have to answer for it." He didn't have to tell me. I'd have to answer for it to a lot of people, including Charles Harcourt. "Get on the phone to the knacker yard right away," I gasped. The farmer waved his arms about. "I've tried that and there's no reply. I tell you, he'll shoot her afore we can stop him. Do you know how much I paid for that cow? Look, never mind about that. Which way did he go?" "Mrs. said he went towards Grampton about 10 minutes ago." I started my engine. "He'll maybe be picking up other beasts. I'll go after him." Teeth clenched, eyes popping, I roared along the Grampton road. The enormity of this latest catastrophe was almost more than I could assimilate. The wrong form was bad enough, but the wrong cow was unthinkable. But it had happened. Charles would crucify me this time. He was a good bloke, but he would have no option, because the higher-ups in the ministry would get wind of an immortal boner like this, and they would howl for blood. Feverishly but vainly I scanned each farm entrance in Grampton Village as I shot through, and when I saw the open countryside ahead of me, again the tension was almost unbearable. I was telling myself that the whole thing was hopeless, when in the far distance, above a row of trees, I spotted the familiar top of Mallock's wagon. It was a high, wood-sided vehicle, and I couldn't mistake it. Repressing a shout of triumph, I put my foot on the boards and set off in that direction with the fanatical zeal of the hunter. But it was a long way off, and I hadn't travelled a mile before I realised I had lost it. Over the years, many things have stayed in my memory, but the great cow chase is engraven deeper than most. The sheer terror I felt is vivid to this day. I kept sighting the wagon among the maze of lanes and side roads, but by the time I had cut across country, my quarry had disappeared behind a hillside or dipped into one of the many hollows in the wide vista. I was constantly deceived by the fact that I expected him to be turning towards Darrowby after passing through a village, but he never did. Clearly he had other business on the way. The whole thing seemed to last a very long time, and there was no fun in it for me. I was gripped throughout by a cold dread, and the violent swings, the alternating sense of hope and despair, were wearing to the point of exhaustion. I was utterly drained when at last I saw the tall lorry rocking along a straight road in front of me. I had him now. Forcing my little car to the limit, I drew abreast of him, sounding my horn repeatedly till he stopped. Breathlessly, I pulled up in front of him and ran round to offer my explanations. But as I looked up into the driver's cab, my eager smile vanished. It wasn't Jeff Mallock at all. I had been following the wrong man. It was the Kett fella. He had exactly the same type of wagon as Mallock, and he went round a wide area of Yorkshire picking up the nameless odds and ends of the dead animals which even the knacker men didn't want. It was a strange job, and he was a strange-looking man. The oddly piercing eyes glittered uncannily from under a tattered army-peaked cap. "What's up, governor?" He removed a cigarette from his mouth and spat companionably into the roadway. My throat was tight. I'm sorry, I thought you were Jeff Mallock." The eyes did not change expression, but the corner of his mouth twitched briefly. "If thou wants Jeff, he'll be back at his yard now, I reckon." He spat again and replaced his cigarette. I nodded dully. Jeff would be there now, all right. Long ago. I had been chasing the wrong wagon for about an hour, and that cow would be dead and hanging up on hooks at this moment. The knacker man was a fast and skilful worker, and wasted no time when he got back with his beasts. "Well, I'm off home now," the Kett fella said. "So long, boss." He winked at me, started his engine, and the big vehicle rumbled away. I trailed back to my car. There was no hurry now. And strangely, now that all was lost, my mood relaxed. In fact, as I drove away, a great calm settled on me, and I began to assess my future with cool objectivity. I would be drummed out of the ministry service for sure. And idly I wondered if they had any special ceremony for the occasion. Perhaps a ritual stripping of the panel certificates, or something of the sort. I tried to put away the thought that more than the ministry would be interested in my latest exploit. How about the Royal College? Did they strike you off for something like this? Well, it was possible, and in my serene state of mind I toyed with the possibilities of alternative avenues of employment. I had often thought it must be fun to run a second-hand bookshop, and now that I began to consider it seriously, I felt there was an opening for one in Darrowby. I experienced a comfortable glow at the vision of myself sitting under the rows of dusty volumes, pulling one down from the shelf when I felt like it, or maybe just looking out into the street through the window from my safe little world where there were no forms or telephones or messages saying, "Ring Min." In Darrowby I drove round without haste to the knacker yard. I left my car outside the grim little building with the black smoke drifting from its chimney. I pulled back the sliding door and saw Jeff seated at his ease on a pile of cowhides, holding a slice of apple pie in blood-stained fingers. And, yes, there, just behind him, hung the two great sides of beef, and on the floor, the lungs, bowels, and other viscera, the sad remnants of Mr. Moverley's pedigree Ayrshire. "Hello, Jeff," I said. "Now then, Mr. Herriot." He gave me the beatific smile which mirrored his personality so well. "I'm just having a little snack," I always like a bite about this time. He sank his teeth into the pie and chewed appreciatively. So I see. I sorrowfully scanned the hanging carcass. Just dog meat, and not even much of that. Ayrshire's were never very fat. I was wondering how to break the news to him when he spoke again. "I'm sorry you've caught me out this time, Mr. Herriot," he said, reaching for a greasy mug of tea. "What do you mean?" "Well, I allus reckoned to have beasts dressed and ready for you, but you've come a bit early." I stared at him. "But everything's here, surely." I waved a hand around me. Nay, that's not her." "You mean that isn't the cow from Moverley's?" "That's right." He took a long draught from the mug and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I had to do this in first. Moverley's cow's still in wagon out the back." "Alive?" He looked mildly surprised. "Aye, of course. She's never had a finger on her. Nice cow for a screw, too." I could have fainted with relief. "She's no screw, Jeff. That's the wrong cow you've got there." "Wrong cow?" Nothing ever startled him, but he obviously desired more information. I told him the whole story. When I had finished, his shoulders began to shake gently, and the beautiful clear eyes twinkled in the pink face. "Well, that's a lick, yeah?" he murmured, and continued to laugh gently. There was nothing immoderate in his mirth, and indeed nothing I said disturbed him in the least. The fact that he had wasted his journey, or that the farmer might be annoyed, was of no moment to him. Again, looking at Jeff Mallock, it struck me, as many times before, that there was nothing like a lifetime of dabbling among diseased carcasses and lethal bacteria for breeding tranquility of mind. "You'll slip back and change the cow?" I said. "Aye, in a minute or two. There's nowt spoiling. I never likes to worry me grub." He belched contentedly. "And how about you, Mr. Herriot? You could do with something to keep your strength up." He produced another mug and broke off a generous wedge of pie, which he offered to me. No, thank you, Jeff. It's kind of you, but no, not just now." He shrugged his shoulders and smiled as he stretched an arm for his pipe, which was balanced on a sheep's skull. Flicking away some shreds of stray tissue from the stem, he applied a match and settled down blissfully on the hides. "I'll see you later, then," he said. "Come round tonight and everything will be ready for you." He closed his eyes, and again his shoulders quivered. "I'd better get the right one this time." It must be more than 20 years since I took a cow under the TB order, because the clinical cases so rarely exist now. Ring Min no longer has the power to chill my blood, and the dread forms which scarred my soul lie unused and yellowing in the bottom of a drawer. All these things have gone from my life. Charles Harcourt has gone too, but I think of him every day when I look at the little barometer which still hangs on my wall. Chapter 35. The food was so good at the Winkfield Flying School that it was said that those airmen whose homes were within visiting distance wouldn't take a day's leave because they might miss some culinary speciality. Difficult to believe? Maybe. But I often think that few people in wartime Britain fared as well as the handful of young men in the scatter of wooden huts on that flat green stretch outside Windsor. It wasn't as though we had a French chef either. The cooking was done by two grizzled old men, civilians who wore cloth caps and smoked pipes and went about their business with unsmiling taciturnity. It was rumoured that they were two ex-army cooks from the First World War, but whatever their origins, they were artists. In their hands, simple stews and pies assumed a new significance, and it was possible to rhapsodize even over the perfect flouriness of their potatoes. So it was surprising when at lunchtime my neighbour on the left threw down his spoon, pushed away his plate, and groaned. We ate on trestle tables, sitting in rows on long forms, and I was right up against the young man. "What's wrong?" I asked. "This apple dumpling's terrific." "Oh, it's not the grub." He buried his face in his hands for a few seconds, then looked at me with tortured eyes. "I've been doing circuits and bumps this morning with Routledge, and he's torn the knackers off me. All the time. It never stopped." Suddenly my own meal lost some of its flavour. I knew just what he meant. Flight Officer Woodham did the same to me. He gave me another despairing glance, then stared straight ahead. "I know one thing, Jim. I'll never make a bloody pilot." His words sent a chill through me. He was voicing the conviction which had been gradually growing in me. I never seemed to make any progress. Whatever I did was wrong, and I was losing heart. Like all the others, I was hoping to be a graded pilot, but after every session with Flight Officer Woodham, the idea of ever flying an aeroplane all on my own seemed more and more ludicrous. And I had another date with him at 2 p.m. He was as quiet and charming as ever when I met him, till we got up into the sky and the shouting started again. "Relax, for heaven's sake, relax!" Or, "What's your height? Where the hell do you think you're going?" Or, "Didn't I tell you to centralise the stick? Are you bloody deaf or something?" And finally, after the first circuit, when we juddered to a halt on the grass, "That was an absolutely bloody ropey landing. Take off again." On the second circuit, he fell strangely silent. And though I should have felt relieved, I found something ominous in the unaccustomed peace. It could only mean one thing. He had finally given me up as a bad job. When we landed, he told me to switch off the engine and climbed out of the rear cockpit. I was about to unbuckle my straps and follow him when he signalled me to remain in my seat. "Stay where you are," he said. "You can take her up now." I stared down at him through my goggles. "What?" "I said, take her up." "You mean on my own? What, go solo?" "Yes, of course. Come and see me in the flight hut after you've landed and taxied in." He turned and walked away over the green. He didn't look back. After a few minutes, a fitter came over to where I sat trembling in my seat. He spat on the turf, then looked at me with deep distaste. "Look, mate," he said, "that's a good aircraft you got there." I nodded agreement. "Well, I don't want it. Well, smashed up, okay?" "Okay." He gave me a final, disgusted glance, then went round to the propeller. Panic-stricken though I was, I did not forget the cockpit drill which had been dinned into me so often. I never thought I'd have to use it in earnest, but now I automatically tested the controls: rudder, ailerons, and elevator. Fuel on, switch off, throttle closed, then switch on, throttle slightly open. "Contact!" I cried. The fitter swung the propeller, and the engine roared. I pushed the throttle full open, and the tiger moth began to bump its way over the grass. As we gathered speed, I eased the stick forward to lift the tail. Then, as I pulled it back again, the bumping stopped and we climbed smoothly into the air with the long dining hut at the end of the airfield flashing away beneath. I was gripped by exhilaration and triumph. The impossible had happened. I was up here on my own, flying, really flying, at last. I had been so certain of failure that the feeling of relief was overpowering. In fact, it intoxicated me, so that for a long time I just sailed along, grinning foolishly to myself. When I finally came to my senses, I looked down happily over the side. It must be time to turn now. But as I stared downwards, cold reality began to roll over me in a gathering flood. I couldn't recognize a thing in the great hazy tapestry beneath me, and everything seemed smaller than usual. Dry-mouthed, I looked at the altimeter. I was well over 2,000 feet. And suddenly it came to me that Flight Officer Woodham's shouts had not been meaningless. He had been talking sense, giving me good advice, and as soon as I got up in the air by myself, I had ignored it all. I hadn't lined myself up on a cloud, I hadn't watched my artificial horizon, I hadn't kept an eye on the altimeter, and I was lost. It was a terrible feeling, this sense of utter isolation as I desperately scanned the great checkered landscape for a familiar object. What did you do in a case like this? Soar around southern England till I found some farmer's field big enough to land in, then make my own abject way back to Wingfield? But that way I was going to look the complete fool, and also I'd stand an excellent chance of smashing up this fitter's beloved aeroplane, and maybe myself. It seemed to me that one way or another I was going to make a name for myself. Funny things had happened to some of the other lads. Many had been airsick and vomited in the cockpit. One had gone through a hedge. Another, on his first solo, had circled the airfield again and again. 7 times he had gone round, trying to find the courage to land while his instructor sweated blood and cursed on the ground. But nobody had really got lost like me. Nobody had flown off into the blue and returned on foot without his aeroplane. My visions of my immediate fate were reaching horrific proportions, and my heart was hammering uncontrollably when far away on my left I spotted the dear, familiar bulk of the big stand on Ascot Racecourse. Almost weeping with joy, I turned towards it, and within minutes I was banking above its roof as I had done so often. And there, far below, and approaching with uncomfortable speed, was the belt of trees which fringed the airfield, and beyond, the windsock blowing over the wide green. But I was still far too high. I could never drop down there in time to hit that landing strip. I would have to go round again. The ignominy of it went deep. They would all be watching on the ground, and some would have a good laugh at the sight of Herriot overshooting the field by several hundred feet and cruising off again into the clouds. But what was I thinking about? There was a way of losing height rapidly, and, bless you, Flight Officer Woodham, I knew how to do it. Opposite, rudder and stick. He had told me 100 times how to side-slip, and I did it now as hard as I could, sending the little machine slewing like an airborne crab down, down towards those trees. And by golly, it worked. The green copse rushed up at me, and before I knew I was almost skimming the branches. I straightened up and headed for a long stretch of grass. At 50 feet, I rounded out, then checked the stick gradually back till just above the ground, when I slammed it into my abdomen. The undercarriage made contact with the earth with hardly a tremor, and I worked the rudder bar to keep straight until I came to a halt. Then I taxied in, climbed from the cockpit, and walked over to the flight hut. Flight Officer Woodham was sitting at a table, cup in hand, and he looked up as I entered. He had got out of his flying suit and was wearing a battle-dress jacket with the wings we all dreamt about, and the ribbon of the DFC. "Ah, Herriot, I'm just having some coffee. Will you join me?" "Thank you, sir." I sat down, and he pushed the cup towards me. "I saw your landing," he said. "Delightful. Quite delightful." "Thank you, sir." "And that side-slip?" One corner of his mouth twitched upwards. "Very good indeed. Really masterly." He reached for the coffee pot and went on. "You've done awfully well, Herriot. Solo after 9 hours' instruction, eh? Splendid. But then I never had the slightest doubt about you at any time." He poised the pot over my cup. "How'd you like your coffee? Black or white?" Chapter 36. I was only the 3rd man in our flight of 50 to go solo, and it was a matter of particular pride to me because so many of my comrades were 18 and 19-year-olds. They didn't say so, but I often had the impression that they felt that an elderly gentleman like me in my 20s with a wife and baby had no right to be there, training for aircrew. In the nicest possible way, they thought I was past it. Of course, in many ways they had a point. The pull I had from home was probably stronger than theirs. When our sergeant handed out the letters on the daily parade, I used to secrete mine away till I had a few minutes of solitude to read about how fast little Jimmy was growing, how much he weighed, the unmistakable signs of outstanding intelligence, even genius, which Helen could already discern in him. I was missing his babyhood, and it saddened me. It is still something I deeply regret, because it comes only once, and is gone so quickly. But I still have the bundles of letters which his proud mother wrote to keep me in touch with every fascinating stage, and when I read them now it is almost as though I had been there to see it all. At the time, those letters pulled me back almost painfully to the comforts of home. But, on the other hand, there were occasions when life in Darrowby hadn't been all that comfortable. I think it was the early morning calls in the winter that were the worst. It was a fairly common experience to be walking sleepy-eyed into a cow byre at 6 a.m. for a calving, but at Mr. Blackburn's farm there was a difference. In fact, several differences. Firstly, there was usually an anxious-faced farmer to greet me with news of how the calf was coming when labour had started, but today I was like an unwelcome stranger. Secondly, I had grown accustomed to the sight of a few cows tied up in a cobbled byre with wooden partitions, and an oil lamp, and now I was gazing down a long avenue of concrete under blazing electric lights with a seemingly endless succession of bovine backsides protruding from tubular metal standings. Thirdly, instead of the early morning peace, there was a clattering of buckets, the rhythmic pulsing of a milking machine, and the blaring of a radio loudspeaker. There was also a frantic scurrying of white-coated, white-capped men, but none of them paid the slightest attention to me. This was one of the new big dairy farms. In place of a solitary figure on a milk stool, head buried in the cow's side, pulling forth the milk with a gentle hiss-hiss, there was this impersonal hustle and bustle. I stood just inside the doorway while out in the yard a particularly cold snow drifted from the blackness above. I had left a comfortable bed and a warm wife to come here, and it seemed somebody ought at least to say hello. Then I noticed the owner hurrying past with a bucket. He was moving as fast as any of his men. "Hey, Mr. Blackburn," I cried. "You rang me. You've got a cow calving." He stopped and looked at me uncomprehendingly for a moment. "Oh, aye. She's down there on right." He pointed to a light roan animal halfway along the byre. She was easy to pick out, the only one lying down. "How long has she been on?" I asked. But when I turned round, Mr. Blackburn had gone. I trotted after him, cornered him in the milk-house, and repeated my question. "Oh, she should have calved last night. Must be somewhat amiss." He began to pour his bucket of milk over the cooler into the churn. "Have you had a feel inside her?" "Nay, I haven't had time." He turned harassed eyes towards me. "We're a bit behind with milking this morning. We can't be late for milkman." I knew what he meant. The drivers who collected the churns for the big dairy companies were a fierce body of men, probably kind husbands and fathers at normal times, but subject to violent outbursts of rage if they were kept waiting even for an instant. I couldn't blame them because they had a lot of territory to cover and many farms to visit, but I had seen them when provoked, and their anger was frightening to behold. "All right," I said. "Can I have some hot water, soap, and a towel, please?" Mr. Blackburn jerked his head at the corner of the milk-house. "You'll have to help yourself. There's everything there. I must get on." He went off again at a brisk walk. Clearly he was more in fear of the milkman than he was of me. I filled a bucket, found a piece of soap, and threw a towel over my shoulder. When I reached my patient, I looked in vain for some signs of a name. So many of the cows of those days had their names printed above their stalls, but there were no Marigolds, Alices, or Snowdrops here. Just numbers. Before taking off my jacket, I looked casually in the ear where the tattoo mark stood out plainly against the creamy white surface. She was number 87. I was in more trouble when I stripped off my shirt. In a modern byre like this, there were no nails jutting from the walls to serve as hangers. I had to roll my clothes into a ball and carry them through to the milk-house. There I found a sack which I tied round my middle with a length of binder twine. Still ignored by everybody, I returned, soaked my arm, and inserted it into the cow. I had to go a long way in to reach the calf, which was strange considering the birth should have taken place last night. It was the top of the little creature's head I touched first. The nose was tucked downwards instead of thrusting its way along the vagina towards the outside world, and the legs were similarly coiled under the body. And I noticed something else. The entry of my arm did not provoke any answering strain from the cow, nor did she try to rise to her feet. There was something else troubling number 87. Lying flat on the concrete, still buried to the shoulder in the cow, I raised my head and looked along the shaggy back with its speckle of light red and white hairs, and when I reached the neck I knew I need seek no further. The lateral kink was very obvious. Number 87, slumped on her chest, was gazing wearily and without interest at the wall in front of her, but there was that funny little bend in her neck that told me everything. I got up, washed and dried my arm, and looked for Mr. Blackburn. I found him bending by the side of a fat brown animal pulling the cups from her teats. I tapped him on the shoulder. "She's got milk fever," I said. "Oh, aye," he replied. Then he hoisted the bucket, brushed past me, and made off down the byre. I kept pace with him. "That's why she can't strain. Her uterus has lost its tone. She'll never calve till she gets some calcium." "Right." He still didn't look at me. "You'll give her some, then?" "Yes." I said to his retreating back. The snow still swirled in the outer darkness, and I toyed with the idea of getting dressed. But I'd only have to strip again, so I decided to make a dash for it. With the car boot open, it seemed to take a long time to fish out the bottles and flutter valve, with the flakes settling thickly on my naked flesh. Back in the bar, I looked round for a spare man to help me, but there was no lessening of the feverish activity. I would have to roll this cow onto her side and inject into her milk vein without assistance. It all depended on how comatose she was. And she must have been pretty far gone, because when I braced my feet against the tubular steel and pushed both hands against her shoulder, she flopped over without resistance. To keep her there, I lay on top of her as I pushed in the needle and ran the calcium into the vein. One snag was that my sprawling position took me right underneath the neighbouring cow on the right, a skittish sort of animal who didn't welcome the rubber-booted legs tangling with her hind feet. She expressed her disapproval by treading painfully on my ankles and giving me a few smart kicks on the thigh, but I dared not move because the calcium was flowing in beautifully. When the bottle was empty, I kneed my patient back onto her chest and ran another bottle of calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus under her skin. By the time I had finished and rubbed away the subcutaneous fluid, number 87 was looking decidedly happier. I didn't hurry over cleaning and putting away my injection outfit and re-soaping my arms, because I knew that every minute would bring back strength to my patient. The lightning response to intravenous calcium has always afforded me a simple pleasure, and when I pushed my arm in again, the difference was remarkable. The previously flaccid uterus gripped at my hand, and as the cow went into a long, expulsive effort, she turned her head, looked back at me, and opened her mouth in a muffled bellow. It was not a sound of pain, but rather as though she was saying, "I'm back in business now." "All right, my lass," I replied. "I'll stay with you till it's all over." At other times I might have been a little chary of being overheard conversing with a cow, but with the clamour of buckets and the non-stop blasting of the radio, there was no chance of that happening. I knew that I had to guide the calf back into the correct position, and that would take time. But I had a strange sense of oneness with this animal, because neither of us seemed to be of the slightest importance in the present setting. As I lay there face down on the concrete, which grew harder all the time, and with the milkers stumbling over my prostrate form, I felt very much alone. There was just myself and number 87 for it. Another thing I missed was the sense of occasion. There was a compensation in many arduous carving and the feeling of a little drama being enacted. The worried farmer, attentive stockman, the danger of losing the calf or even the mother. It was a gripping play, and there was no doubt the vet was the leading man. He may even be the villain, but he was number one. And here I was now, a scrabbling nonentity with hardly a mention in the cast. It was the shape of things to come. And yet, the job was still there. I lifted the calf's lower jaw, and as the cow gave a heave, I eased it over the brim of the pelvis. Then I groped for the tiny legs and straightened them as another expulsive effort pushed the little creature towards me. He was definitely on his way now. I didn't rush things, just lay there and let the cow get on with it. My worst moment was when one of the men came to put the milking machine on the temperamental animal on my right. As he tried to step beside her, she swung round, cocked her tail, and sent a jet of feces cascading over my back. The man pushed her back into place, slipped on the teat cups, then lifted the hose, which was lying ready for swilling down the byre. A moment later I felt the icy flow of water playing from my shoulders to my hips, then the application of a spare udder cloth as the helpful fellow cleaned me off. "Thanks very much," I gasped, and I was really grateful. It was the only attention I had received all morning. Within half an hour the feet appeared at the vulva, followed by a wet nose whose nostrils twitched reassuringly. But they were big feet. This would be a bull calf, and his final entry into the world could be a tight squeeze. I got into a sitting position and gripped a slippery cloven hoof in each hand. Leaning back, feet against the dung channel, I addressed number 87 again. "Come on, old lass. A couple of good shoves and we're there." She responded with a mighty inflation of the abdomen, and the calf surged towards me as I pulled, giving me a glimpse of a broad forehead and a pair of slightly puzzled eyes. For a moment I thought the ears were going to slip through, but then the cow relaxed, and the head disappeared back inside. "Once more, girl," I pleaded, and this time it seemed that she had decided to stop playing around and get the job over with. She gave a prolonged strain which sent head and shoulders through, and as I hauled away I had only that momentary panic I always feel that the hips might jam in the pelvis. But this one didn't stick, and came sliding beautifully onto my lap. Puffing slightly, I got to my feet and parted the hind legs. Sure enough, the little scrotum was there. He was a fine bull calf. I pulled some hay from the rack and dried him off, and within minutes he was sitting up, sniffing and snorting, looking around him with interest. He wasn't the only interested party. His mother, craning round in her neck chain, gazed fascinatedly at the new arrival before releasing a deafening bellow. I seized the front feet again and pulled the calf up to the front of the stall, where the cow, after a brief examination, began to lick him from head to tail. Then, as I watched, entranced, she suddenly rose to her feet so that she could reach some of the little creature's more inaccessible corners. I smiled to myself. So, that was that. She had got over the milk fever and had a nice live calf, too. All was well with number 87. Mr. Blackburn came up and stood by my side, and I realized that the noise in the byre had subsided. The milking was finished. The farmer took off his white hat and wiped away the sweat from his brow. "By God, that was a rush. We were short-handed this morning, and I was sure we were going to miss that milk fella. He's a terror, won't wait a minute, and I've had to chase after him in a tractor with the churns afore now." As he finished speaking, a hen leapt with a squawk from the rack. Mr. Blackburn reached forward and lifted a warm, new-laid egg out of the hay. He inspected it for a moment, then turned to me. "Have you had your breakfast?" "No, of course not." "Well, tell your missus to put this in the frying pan," he said, handing me the egg. "Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Blackburn. I'll enjoy that." He nodded and continued to stand there, gazing at the cow and calf. Dairy farming is one of the hardest ways of making a living, and this pre-dawn turmoil was an everyday occurrence in his life. But I knew he was pleased with my efforts because he faced me suddenly, and his weathered features broke into a delighted grin. Without warning, he gave me a friendly thump on the chest. "Good old Jim," he said, and walked away. I dressed, got into the car, and placed my egg with the utmost care on the dash. Then I eased myself gingerly onto the seat, because that hosing had sent a pint or two of dirty water down into my underpants, and sitting down was intensely uncomfortable. As I drove away, the darkness was thinning into the grey beginning of a new day, and around me the white bulk of the fells began to lift from the half-light, massive, smooth, and inexpressibly cold. I looked at the egg rocking gently on the dash and smiled to myself. I could still see Mr. Blackburn's sudden grin, still feel his punch on the chest, and my main sensation was of reassurance. Systems may be changing, but cows and calves and Yorkshire farmers were just the same. Chapter 37. On my wage of 7 and threepence a day, out of which was deducted maintenance for wife and child, I was unable to indulge in high living, even if I wanted to. But one evening in Windsor I decided to allow myself the luxury of one glass of beer. And as I pushed open the pub doorway, the first thing I saw was a man sitting at the corner of the bar with a small dog under his chair. Little things like that could lift me effortlessly back to my old life, and I could almost hear George Wilkes, the auctioneer in the Drover's Arms at Darrowby. "I reckon that's the best pub terrier I've ever seen." He bent down from the bar counter and patted Theo's shaggy head as it protruded from beneath his master's stool. It struck me that pub terrier wasn't a bad description. Theo was small and mainly white, though there were odd streaks of black on his flanks, and his muzzle had a bushy outgrowth of hair which made him undeniably attractive, but still more mysterious. I warmed to a Scottish colleague recently who, when pressed by a lady client to diagnose her dog's breed and lineage, replied finally, "Madam, I think it would be best just to call him a wee brown dug." By the same token, Theo could be safely described as a wee white dug, but in Yorkshire the expression pub terrier would be more easily understood. His master, Paul Cotterell, looked down from his high perch. "What's he saying about you, old chap?" he murmured languidly, and at the sound of his voice the little animal leapt, eager and wagging, from his retreat. Theo spent a considerable part of his life between the 4 metal legs of that stool, as did his master on the seat, and it often seemed to me to be a waste of time for both of them. I often took my own dog Sam into pubs, and he could squat beneath my seat, but whereas it was an occasional thing with me, maybe once or twice a week, with Paul Cotterell it was an unvarying ritual. Every night, from 8 o'clock onwards, he could be found sitting there at the end of the bar of the Drover's Arms, pint-glass in front of him, little curly pipe drooping over his chin. For a young man like him, he was a bachelor in his late 30s, and a person of education and intelligence. It seemed a sterile existence. He turned to me as I approached the counter. "Hello, Jim. Let me get you a drink." "That's very kind of you, Paul," I replied. "I'll have a pint." "Splendid." He turned to the barmaid with easy courtesy. "Could I trouble you, Mora?" We sipped our beer and we chatted. This time it was about the music festival at Broughton, and then we got on to music in general. As with any other topic I discussed with him, he seemed to know a lot about it. "So you're not all that keen on Bach?" he inquired lazily. "No, not really. Some of it, yes, but on the whole I like something a bit more emotional. Elgar, Beethoven, Mozart, even Tchaikovsky. I suppose you highbrows look down your noses at him." He shrugged, puffed his little pipe, and regarded me with a half-smile, one eyebrow raised. He often looked like that, and it made me feel he ought to wear a monocle. But he didn't enthuse about Bach, though it seemed he was his favourite composer. He never enthused about anything, and he listened with that funny look on his face while I rhapsodied about the Elgar violin concerto. Paul Cotterell was from the south of England, but the locals had long since forgiven him for that, because he was likeable, amusing, and always ready to buy anybody a drink from his corner in the Drovers. To me he had a charm which was very English, casual, effortless. He never got excited, he was always polite, and utterly self-contained. "While you're here, Jim," he said, "I wonder if you'd have a look at Theo's foot." "Of course." It is one of a vet's occupational hazards that wherever he goes socially, it is taken for granted that there is nothing he would rather do than dole out advice or listen to symptoms. "Let's have him up." "Here, boy, come on." Paul patted his knee, and the little dog jumped up and sat there, eyes sparkling with pleasure. And I thought, as I always did, that Theo should be in pictures. He was the perfect film dog with that extraordinary fuzzy laugh face. People paid good money to see dogs like him in cinemas all over the world. "All right, Theo," I said, scooping him from his master's knee. "What's the trouble?" Paul indicated the right forefoot with the stem of his pipe. "It's that one. He's been going a bit lame off and on for the last few days." "I see." I rolled the little animal on his back and then laughed. "Oh, he's only got a broken claw. There's a little bit hanging off here. He must have caught it on a stone. Hang on a minute." I delved into my pocket for the scissors which always dwelt there. A quick snip, and the job was done. "Is that all?" asked Paul. "Yes, that's it." One eyebrow went up mockingly as he looked at Theo. "So that's what you were making all the fuss about, eh? Silly old trout." He snapped his fingers. "Back you go." The little dog obediently leapt to the carpet and disappeared into his sanctuary beneath the stool. And at that moment I had a flash of intuition about Paul, about his charm which I had often admired and envied. He didn't really care. He was fond of his dog, of course. He took him everywhere with him, exercised him regularly by the river, but there was none of the anxiety, the almost desperate concern which I had so often seen in the eyes of my clients when I dealt with even the most trivial of their ailments. They cared too much, as I have always done with my own animals. And of course he was right. It was an easier and more comfortable way to live. Caring made you vulnerable, while Paul cruised along impregnable. That attractive casualness, the nonchalant good manners, the imperturbability, they all had their roots in the fact that nothing touched him very deeply. And despite my snap diagnosis of his character, I still envied him. I have always been blown around too easily by my emotions. It must be lovely to be like Paul. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how everything fitted in. He had never cared enough to get married. Even Bach, with his mathematical music, was part of the pattern. I think that major operation deserves another pint, Jim. He smiled his lopsided smile. Unless you demand a higher fee. I laughed. I would always like him. We are all different, and we have to act as we are made, but as I started my second glass, I thought again of his carefree life. He had a good job in the government offices in Broughton. No domestic responsibilities, and every night he sat on that same stool drinking beer with his dog underneath. He hadn't a worry in the world. Anyway, he was part of the Derby scene, part of something I liked, and since I have always hated change, it was in a sense reassuring to know that no matter what night you went into the Drovers, you would find Paul Cottrell in the corner and Theo's shaggy muzzle peeping from below. I felt like that one night when I dropped in near closing time. Do you think he's got worms? The question was typically offhand. I don't know, Paul. Why do you ask? He drew on his pipe. Oh, I just thought he looked a bit thin lately. Come up, Theo. The little dog, perched on his master's knee, looked as chirpy as ever, and when I reached over and lifted him, he licked my hand. But his ribs did feel rather prominent. Yes, I said. Maybe he has lost a bit of weight. Have you noticed him passing any worms? Well, I haven't, actually. Not even little bits? Whitish segments sticking round his rear? No, Jim. He shook his head and smiled. But I haven't looked all that closely, old boy. Okay, I said, let's worm him just in case. I'll bring in some tablets tomorrow night. You'll be here? The eyebrow went up. I think that's highly probable. Theo duly got his worm tablets, and after that there was a space of several weeks when I was too busy to visit the Drovers. When I finally did get in, it was a Saturday night, and the athletic club dance was in full spate. A rhythmic beat drifted from the ballroom, the little bar was packed, and the domino players were under pressure, squashed into a corner by the crush of dinner jackets and backless dresses. In the noise and heat, I struggled towards the bar, thinking that the place was unrecognizable. But there was one feature unchanged. Paul Cottrell on his stool at the far end of the counter. I squeezed in next to him and saw he was wearing his usual tweed jacket. Not dancing, Paul? He half closed his eyes, shook his head slowly, and smiled at me over his bent little pipe. Not for me, old boy, he murmured. Too much like work. I glanced down and saw that something else hadn't changed. Theo was there too, keeping his nose well clear of the milling feet. I ordered 2 beers, and we tried to converse, but it was difficult to shout above the babel. Arms kept poking between us towards the counter. Red faces pushed into ours and shouted greetings. Most of the time, we just looked around us. Then Paul leant close and spoke into my ear. I gave Theo those pills, but he's still getting thinner. Really? I shouted back. That's unusual. Yes. Perhaps you'd have a look at him? I nodded, he snapped his finger, and the little dog was on his knee in an instant. I reached and lifted him onto mine and noticed immediately that he was lighter in my hands. You're right, I said. He's still losing weight. Balancing the dog in my lap, I pulled down an eyelid and saw that the conjunctiva was pale. I shouted again. He's anemic! I felt my way back over his face, and behind the angle of the jaw I found that the postpharyngeal lymph glands were greatly enlarged. This was strange. Could he have some form of mouth or throat infection? I looked helplessly around me, wishing fervently that Paul wouldn't invariably consult me about his dog in a pub. I wanted to examine the animal, but I couldn't very well deposit him among the glasses on the bar. I was trying to get a better grip with a view to looking down his throat when my hand slipped behind his foreleg, and my heart gave a sudden thump as I encountered the axillary gland. It, too, was grossly enlarged. I whipped my fingers back into his groin, and there was the inguinal gland, prominent as an egg. The prescapula was the same, and as I groped feverishly I realized that every superficial lymph gland was several times its normal size. Hodgkin's disease. For a few moments I was oblivious of the shouting and laughter, the muffled blare of music. Then I looked at Paul, who was regarding me calmly as he puffed his pipe. How could I tell him in these surroundings? He would ask me what Hodgkin's disease was, and I would have to explain that it was a cancer of the lymphatic system and that his dog was surely going to die. As my thoughts raced, I stroked the shaggy head, and Theo's comic whiskered face turned towards me. People jostled past. Hands reached out and bore gins and whiskies and beers past my face. A fat man threw his arm round my neck. I leant across. "Paul," I said. "Yes, Jim. Will you bring Theo round to the surgery tomorrow morning? It's 10 o'clock on a Sunday." Mentally, the eyebrow twitched upwards. Then he nodded. "Right, old boy." I didn't bother to finish my drink. I began to push my way towards the door, and as the crush closed around me, I glanced back. The little dog's tail was just disappearing under the stool. Next day, I had one of those early waking mornings when I started tossing around at 6 o'clock and finished by staring at the ceiling. Even after I had got my feet on the ground and brought Helen a cup of tea, the waiting was interminable until the moment arrived which I had been dreading, when I faced Paul across the surgery table with Theo standing between us. I told him straight away. I couldn't think of an easy way to lead up to it. His expression did not change, but he took his pipe out of his mouth and looked steadily at me, then at the dog and back again at me. "Oh," he said at last. "I see." I didn't say anything, and he slowly ran his hand along the little animal's back. "Are you quite sure, Jim?" "Absolutely. I'm terribly sorry." "Is there no treatment?" "There are various palliatives, Paul, but I've never seen any of them do any good. The end result is always the same." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "But he doesn't look so bad. What will happen if we don't do anything?" I paused. "Well, as the internal glands enlarge, various things will happen. Ascites, dropsy, will develop in the abdomen. In fact, you see, he's a little pot-bellied now." "Yes, I do see now you mention it. Anything else?" "As the thoracic glands get bigger, he'll begin to pant." "I've noticed that already. He's breathless after a short walk. And all the time he'll get thinner and more debilitated." Paul looked down at his feet for a few moments, then faced me. "So what it amounts to is that he's going to be pretty miserable for the rest of his life." He swallowed. "And how long is that going to be?" "A few weeks. It varies, maybe up to 3 months." "Well, Jim," he smoothed back his hair, "I can't let that happen. It's my responsibility. You must put him to sleep now before he really starts to suffer. Don't you agree?" "Yes, Paul, it's the kindest thing to do." "Will you do it immediately? As soon as I'm out of that door?" "I will," I replied, "and I promise you he won't know a thing." His face held a curious fixity of expression. He put his pipe in his mouth, but it had gone out, so he stuffed it into his pocket. Then he leant forward and patted his dog once on the head. The bushy face with the funny shock of hair round the muzzle turned to him, and for a few seconds they looked at each other. Then, "Goodbye, old chap," he muttered, and strode quickly from the room. I kept my promise. "Good lad. Good old Theo," I murmured, and stroked the face and ears again and again as the little creature slipped peacefully away. Like all vets, I hated doing this, painless though it was. But to me, there has always been a comfort in the knowledge that the last thing these helpless animals knew was the sound of a friendly voice and the touch of a gentle hand. Sentimental, maybe. Not like Paul. He had been practical and utterly rational in the way he had acted. He had been able to do the right thing because he was not at the mercy of his emotions. Later, over a Sunday lunch, which I didn't enjoy as much as usual, I told Helen about Theo. I had to say something because she had produced a delicious pot roast on the gas ring, which was our only means of cooking, and I wasn't doing justice to her skill. Sitting at our bench, I looked down at her. It was my turn for the high stool. "You know, Helen," I said, "that was an object lesson for me. The way Paul acted, I mean. If I'd been in his position, I'd have shilly-shallied, tried to put off something which was inevitable. She thought for a moment. Well, a lot of people would. Yes, but he didn't. I put down my knife and fork and stared at the wall. He behaved in a mature way. I suppose Paul has one of those personalities you read about. Well-adjusted, completely adequate. Come on, Jim, eat your lunch. I know it was a sad thing, but it had to be done, and you mustn't start criticizing yourself. Paul is Paul, and you are you. I started again on the meat. But I couldn't repress the rising sense of my own inadequacy. Then, as I glanced to one side, I saw that my wife was smiling up at me. I suddenly felt reassured. It seemed that she at least didn't seem to mind that I was me. That was on the Sunday, and on Tuesday morning I was handing out some wart lotion to Mr. Sangster, who kept a few dairy cows down by the station. "Dab that on the udder night and morning after milking," I said. "I think you'll find that the warts will start to drop off after a week or two." "Thank you." He handed over £0.50, and I was dropping it into the desk drawer when he spoke again. "Bad job about Paul Cottrell, wasn't it?" "What do you mean?" "I thought you'd have heard," he said. "He's dead." "Dead?" I stared at him stupidly. "How? What?" "Found him this morning. He did away with himself." I leant with both hands on the desk. "Do you mean suicide?" "Aye, that's what they say. Took a lot of pills. It's all out of town." I found myself hunching over the daybook, sightlessly scanning the list of calls while the farmer's voice seemed to come from far away. "It's a bad job, right enough. He were a nice felly. Reckon everybody liked him." Later that day I was passing Paul's lodgings when I saw his landlady, Mrs. Clayton, in the doorway. I pulled up and got out of the car. "Mrs. Clayton," I said, "I still can't believe this." "Nor can I, Mr. Herriot. It's terrible." Her face was pale, her eyes red. "He was with me 6 years, you know. He was like a son." "But why on earth?" "Oh, it was losing his dog that did it. He just couldn't stand it." A great wave of misery rose and engulfed me, and she put her hand on my arm. "Don't look like that, Mr. Herriot. Wasn't your fault. Paul told me all about it, and nobody could have saved Theo. People die of that, never mind dogs." I nodded dumbly, and she went on. "But I'll tell you something in confidence, Mr. Herriot. Paul wasn't able to stand things like you or me. It was the way he was made. You see, he suffered from depression." "Depression? Paul?" "Oh, yes. He's been under the doctor for a long time, and taking pills regularly. He allus puts a brave face on, but he's had nervous trouble off and on for years." "Nervous trouble? I'd never have dreamt." "No, nobody would, but that's how it was. He had an unhappy childhood from what I made out. Maybe that's why he was so fond of his dog. He got too attached to him, really." "Yes." She took out a screwed-up handkerchief and blew her nose. "Well, as I said, the poor lad had a rough time most of his life, but he was brave." There didn't seem anything else to say. I drove away out of the town, and the calm green hills offered a quiet contrast to the turmoil which can fill a man's mind. So much for Herriot as a judge of character. I couldn't have been more wrong. But Paul had fought his secret battle with a courage which had deceived everybody. I reflected on the object lesson which I thought he had given me. But in fact, it was a lesson of another kind, and one which I have never forgotten. There are countless people like Paul who are not what they seem.
Thank you for listening to our audiobooks. We do our best to regularly upload quality books with clear narrations. Please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell icon so we can bring you more great books.
Thank you very much and we hope you enjoyed listening to your audiobook.